Chapter 923. According to the rules of the White Emperor clan and the traditions of the entire demi-human race, if one could not cultivate the Imperial clan's techniques to the highest level, they would not have the right to inherit the throne. In the past tens of thousands of years, there had been no exceptions, and there had never been a monster princess who was able to cultivate the Imperial cultivation method to the highest level. If there were no other princes, then the royal family would conduct a groom selection. The son-in-law would be conferred the title of prince, and after cultivating the royal cultivation method to the highest level, he would become the successor to the demon race's throne. Princess Luo's marrying was a matter that many of the demi-human subjects thought was natural. Who she married was the true crux of the matter, because the man she had chosen was very likely to be the next White Emperor. Xin Yuan didn't see it that way. He and Princess Luo were both students of the Tradition Academy and also Chun Changsheng's patients. He knew better than anyone that the problem with Luo's meridian channels had long been cured by Chun Changsheng. As long as she was given enough time, she could obviously cultivate the imperial family's techniques to the highest level. At that time, she would be the indisputable next White Emperor. Why would there be a need for a marriage? All right. Even if Princess Luo became the next White Emperor, she would still get married. Xin Yuan sat on a rock on the bank of the Red River. Suddenly, he felt that his face was slightly wet. Raindrops fell along with the morning breeze. The sky wanted to rain, and Her Highness wanted to marry. These were all natural things. But why do I feel so sad? Of course, it was not because he had unknown feelings for Her Highness. He was a member of the Tradition Academy, and Her Highness was the vice principal of the Tradition Academy. He had the responsibility to protect Her Highness. He knew that Her Highness did not want to marry anyone else. If something happened to her, how could he face Chun Changsheng? How much would Zhixio look down on him? Would Su Mo cross his name off the list? And Tang 36 mouth. Thinking about that, Xin Yuan felt quite terrified, and his face became somewhat pale. Your Highness, I won't let you get married. He punched the stone beside him hard. His right arm had shrunk quite badly and seemed to have no strength at all. There was moss on the stone, and it only made a light sound. Only by looking closely would one be able to vaguely see that under his sleeves, there were countless, extremely faint electric threads winding around his arm. Xin Yuan left the banks of the Red River. An hour later, a clap of thunder boomed from the shore of the Red River. The storm intensified. The hard rock on the shore cracked in the middle and fell into the river with a rumbling sound. The moss on the surface of the stone was burnt to death. It had been 4 years since he had returned to the imperial city from the capital. Luo's life was very normal. Just like when he was young, he lived in luxury, learned cultivation, learned the zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. Other than worrying about Chun Changsheng and those old friends of the Orthodox Academy, nothing else could affect her mood. Her smile was still so sweet, and her eyes were still so lively, as if they could speak. Today, Princess Luo will be learning the law sword of the Mount Li sword style. In these years, Chun Changsheng had only sent her one letter, but that letter was very long and contained a lot of words. In that letter, Chun Changsheng had carefully arranged her 5 years of homework. From this point of view, although Chun Changsheng wasn't particularly competent as a teacher, it couldn't be said that he didn't put in any effort. As for why he wanted to learn the Mount Li sword style, it was because Chun Changsheng felt that the Mount Li sword style was the best, and it just so happened that the secrets of the Mount Li sword style were in Luo's hands. The morning wind carried drops of rain against the window. Luo's gaze left the sword manual and fell upon the window. She looked at the drizzling rain, but also seemed to look into the distance beyond the rain. In these 4 years, she had been extremely diligent in her studies, not missing a single moment. As long as she could grasp the law sword of the Mount Li sword sect, the homework Chun Changsheng had arranged for her was about to be finished. This was a full year ahead of the estimated time in that letter. If I finish learning all this, teacher will come to see me, right? At the very least, he should write another letter and give me new homework. Luo silently thought, then calmed her mind and continued to read the sword manual. Guardian Li gazed at her with doting eyes, both proud and distressed. The raindrops lightly tapped against the window, and the sounds of kneeling and footsteps could be heard. Luo froze for a moment, then raised her head to glance. Letting out a happy cry, she rushed over. She hugged Madame Mu's arm and lightly shook her head, sweetly smiling. She seemed to be acting coquettishly, but it was more of longing and closeness. Madame Mu smiled as she caressed her face and warmly said a few words of concern. After some idle talk, Luo began to ask for guidance on some of the problems in cultivation, which Madame Mu earnestly answered. Time passed slowly like this. Madame Mu left. Luo gazed in the direction in which she had vanished, the smile on her face gradually fading. For some reason, she seemed rather sad. Has it really been confirmed? Yes, it's already spread throughout the city. The source should be the guards of the Abyssal Pearl Pavilion. Luo's sadness was that Madame Mu had not even told her. She gazed at Guardian Li and asked hopefully, is it possible for father to leave seclusion in half a year? Guardian Li whispered, probably not. In that heaven-shaking battle between the White Emperor and the Demon Lord on the snowy plains to the north of Mount Han, both sides suffering heavy injuries. The Demon Lord had been forced off the throne by the alliance of Black Robe and the Demon Commander, thrown into the abyss, and finally killed by his own son in the snowy mountains using the starry sky. The White Emperor's injuries were similarly severe, and he had gained some enlightenment in this battle. Upon returning to White Emperor City, he began to cultivate in seclusion, recuperating from his injuries in the hopes of advancing a step further. Up until now, this peerlessly domineering demon race supreme being had not appeared for 5 years. Luo gazed at the awe-inspiring lines on the sword manual. After a moment of silence, she asked, what about Guardian Jean? The guard is still very strict. If you want to get in touch with him, it will be very difficult not to be discovered. Guardian Li hesitated for a moment, then added, even if you can get in touch with Guardian Jean, he can't do anything. Reasonable. Luo asked, is Xianyuan still in that small tavern? Guardian Li couldn't help but smile at the mention of Xianyuan Per. And he comes to the palace every day to look at the menu. Luo smiled. Send someone to keep an eye on him. If he tries anything, knock him unconscious and send him back to the capital. Guardian Li softly assented, then couldn't help but sigh. Luo had an extremely noble status, but now that her mother wanted to control her, she had no helper. The only person who could help her, the bear youth who had always wanted to help her, she could not bear for him to be trapped in a perilous situation because of her. Do you know what I fear the most? Luo whispered. Guardian Li froze. Luo fell quiet for a while, then said, what I fear the most is that if mother does this, isn't she afraid that father will get angry? This was also something that Guardian Li had never understood. If mother is not worried, then there are only 2 possibilities. One possibility is that the feelings they've shared for several centuries are fake, and mother will harm father. The most terrifying possibility is that father also knows of this matter. As she said this, Luo's expression was rather perplexed, appearing extremely helpless and weak. Guardian Li finally couldn't help but ask, Your Highness, why have we not sent a letter to the humans? Chapter 924. Sending a letter to the human race was naturally referring to sending a letter to Chen Changsheng. In Guardian Li's view, given the relationship between the Pope and Her Highness as master and disciple, as long as he knew of this matter, he would assuredly think of a way to resolve it. Whether it was personally writing a letter or using some other method, it would place no small amount of pressure on the Empress. The Empress would presumably have some misgivings about her actions. But for some reason, Princess Luo was unwilling to agree. In the past 3 years, the Pope's whereabouts might have been difficult to find, but now the entire continent knew that the Pope had returned and had even accomplished many great deeds. Teacher, I wonder how he's been these past few years. Luo softly said. He still has many things to do. As a student, I can't help him, but I also can't give him any trouble. Guardian Li was rather anxious. How could this be giving him trouble? And that year in the capital. Luo knew what she wanted to say and shook her head. Back in the capital, from the grand examination to the mausoleum of books to the garden of Zhou, you and I seemed to be the Orthodox Academy's greatest backers. But in reality, we were limited by our statuses and simply couldn't do anything. And just like now, teacher has never asked me to do anything. Guardian Li was somewhat confused by her meaning. This is the reason why in these past few years, besides studying, teacher hasn't even sent a single letter. Luo opened her eyes wide and earnestly said, "None of you understand teacher's meaning." "Ah, he really dotes on me." Guardian Li froze, asking, "Then your highness, how do you understand?" Luo matter-of-factly replied, "Because I'm teacher's student." Guardian Li wanted to say a few more words of advice, but seeing her expression, she ultimately only sighed. Luo comforted, "Even if mother has any thoughts, she won't do anything to harm me. After all, I'm her daughter by blood." Guardian Li thought to herself, this truly is reasonable. The Empress only has one precious daughter, so there's no reason for her not to love her. But what if the Empress really wants you to marry the second prince? "You mean that cousin from the great western continent? I met him once when I was very young." Luo recalled her childhood and smiled. "He definitely doesn't want to marry me." Guardian Li thought that second prince is unable to inherit the throne of the great western continent. If he marries princess, he might become the next white emperor, so why wouldn't he be willing? Who wants to marry a tigress? Luo stretched out her two small hands as if she was about to pounce. "If he really becomes bold and insists on marrying me, I'll bite him to death," she said. After saying this, she opened her mouth and roared twice. However, she didn't look like a tiger. She looked more like a kitten. She was extremely cute. How could Guardian Li endure this? She pulled her into her embrace and began to rub her body. She beamed and said, "Who wouldn't like such a treasure like her highness?" Then she thought of a certain matter and snapped, "Only His Holiness the Pope is unlucky." Luo saw her resentful expression and couldn't help but giggle. Then she blinked her eyes and moved closer to her ear to whisper a few words. Guardian Li was slightly taken aback upon hearing this. She asked, "So that's what you think?" Luo opened her eyes wide and said innocently, "I wasn't thinking of anything." Clouds and mist lingered outside the cliff. Tang 36 looked at Zheshio's pale face, and his face also became somewhat pale. "Don't scare me," he said. Zheshio realized that his joke had not been very effective, so he returned to his normal appearance and said no more. Tang 36 turned to Chen Changsheng and asked, "Just what's going on here?" Chen Changsheng replied, "It's just like what you saw." Tang 36 was very angry. Yesterday, he was still in high spirits. How can you tell that he's a man about to die? Yesterday, on the plateau, Chen Changsheng and Zheshio had worked together to kill the White Tiger Divine General. Chen Changsheng's swordplay was admittedly extremely swift and fierce, but the person who had truly decided the situation was Zheshio. Everyone who had seen it with their own eyes would probably find it difficult to forget that scene for the rest of their lives. At the time, Zheshio had silently appeared behind the White Tiger Divine General like a real ghost. The White Tiger Divine General was the second-ranked Divine General of the Great Zhou, and his cultivation had already reached the peak of star condensation. He could be considered one of the strongest 10-some people below the Divine Domain. But when Zheshio had already arrived behind him, he had actually been completely unaware. This matter itself was extremely strange and terrifying to the extreme. And then there was the fact that he had used his wolf claws to tear apart the White Tiger Divine General's almost perfect star domain. The strength Zheshio had displayed on the plateau was many times greater than what he had displayed in the capital several years ago, many times more terrifying. Tang 36 was very shocked. He believed that Zheshio had had another fortuitous encounter in the snowy plains of the north, or that he had rapidly advanced after fighting with demon experts in the last few years. As for his illness, it was naturally completely cured. He had not expected that not only had Zheshio's illness not been cured, it had even gotten worse. The tide rush of blood was a strange illness that Zheshio had brought out of his mother's womb. As he grew older, the illness worsened, and the frequency at which it flared up increased. Accompanied by unbearable pain, his meridians would be broadened, his sea of consciousness would also expand, and his strength would rise at an astonishing rate. This was not a good thing. It was like the water in a river gradually overflowing its dike. It seemed ferocious and unstoppable, but once the dike collapsed, how could the river water remain? The faster his strength rose, the closer his body was to the verge of collapse. From the current situation, Zheshio's strength was rising at an unimaginable speed, which also proved that he was getting closer and closer to that day. There would come a day when the tidal waves of Berserk true essence would burst through his meridians, and the rapidly increasing star radiance would tear apart his body, welcoming him to death. Tang 36 stared at Chen Changsheng and said, "For years ago, you clearly said that you could cure his illness." Chen Changsheng was quiet for a while, then said, "I didn't think it would be so fast." And also, he did not finish because he could not bear to say it. In these last few years, Zheshio had fought far too frequently with demon experts on the snowy plains of the northern border, exhausting his body too much. Moreover, he had not taken medicine on time. These were all important reasons for Zheshio's current condition. Tang 36 continued to stare at him. Chen Changsheng understood his meaning and shook his head. "I sent the first bottle as soon as it was made. It was useless." Tang 36 asked, "Is there no other method?" Chen Changsheng replied, "Ordinary medical techniques are not very useful. In my view, the simplest and most effective method is like what the Divine Empress did at the peak of the Mausoleum of Books. She completely shattered my soul and body and then reforged it. The Tianhai Divine Empress was already dead, and it would be difficult to find a second concealed divinity realm expert in the world. The secluded Wang Zhizi might have reached this legendary realm, but in the depths of the clouds, how could one search for him? There's another method. Use a sufficient amount of sacred light and pour it directly into his body." Chen Changsheng continued, "If we can find a way to the sacred light continent, then there's still hope." Tang 36's complexion improved a little upon hearing this. Although the chances were still slim, hope was still hope. And from Chen Changsheng's words, he could tell that Zheshio's lifespan was probably not as short as he had said, only 10 days to half a month. Tang 36 asked, "Just how much longer can he live?" Chen Changsheng thought it over, but he did not give a definite answer. "I will think of a way to extend this period of time a little longer." It truly did require a little longer, because finding a path or method to the sacred light continent was not easy. More importantly, before this, they had to first resolve the matter of this continent. Zheshio replied, "I will strive to live a few more years." A few days ago, I flipped through some old articles and discovered romance written 10 some years ago. Because of the revision, half of it was cut off from the public version of the last year of the Qing dynasty. So I gathered it up and put it on the WeChat public account. Everyone is welcome to see me from 10 some years ago. Chapter 925. Tang 36's gaze moved back and forth between the two of them as he asked, "How can the two of you be so calm when discussing such a serious and even terrifying matter?" Chen Changsheng replied, "Back in the Orthodox Academy, I told you that I've been sick since I was a child and wouldn't live past the age of 20. Tang 36 naturally would not forget that matter. At the time, the Orthodox Academy had been shrouded in a gloomy fog. Every word Chen Changsheng had said had sounded like his last words to them. Zheshio replied, "I've also been sick since I was a child." Yes, from a certain perspective, Chen Changsheng and Zheshio's lives were extremely similar in their wretchedness. When they came to this world, they knew that they could not stay here for too long. There was no more accurate description of life in the face of death. In a certain period of time in the past, they had probably been depressed, disappointed, and even despaired, staring at the shadow of death night after night until they finally grew numb and became calm. Even now, they were still very young, but they were even more indifferent to death than the vast majority of the world's elders. This was very admirable and also somewhat sorrowful. Hu 32 sighed. Yi Xiaoyan, who had remained silent all this time, turned around and rubbed her eyes. The cliff was quiet, the mood rather gloomy. Tang 36 felt even more strange and inexplicably apologetic. He mumbled, "Shouldn't I have also been sick since I was a child?" Zhixio expressionlessly replied, "You've always been sick." Tang 36's eyes went round as he asked, "What illness?" Chun Changsheng replied, "The illness of wealth?" Tang 36 saw that they were still in the mood to tease him and knew that the situation was not as tense and terrible as he had imagined. He somewhat relaxed and patted Zhixio on the shoulder. "Then let's go. Whether it's a dragon's pool, a tiger's den, or the myriad sword array, I'll accompany you today and fulfill your last wish." He was naturally speaking of that mountain shrouded in clouds. Zhixio replied, "I might not necessarily die, so I can't say it's my last wish." Chun Changsheng replied, "Correct. I've already lived to 20. Tang 36 asked, "Then why do we have to go to Mount Li?" Chun Changsheng replied, "Because Mount Li is there. There's a saying in the spy. Why do we fight? Because the enemy was there." It's a famous saying from the mountaineering world. It's very sour, but I think it's very cute. I know that it's very cheap to use it here, but I can't help but use it. Everyone, close your eyes and bear with it. Why go Mount Li? Because Qi Jian was at Mount Li. If Zhixio wanted to see her, it was just that simple. Moreover, Mount Li was very close to Holy Maiden Peak, so it wouldn't take long for them to arrive. To Chun Changsheng, besides satisfying Zhixio's wishes, this trip to Mount Li this time had an even more important reason. He had once read a certain treatise on the sword in the Taoist canon, which mentioned that the Mount Li sword sect had a method that should be able to temporarily stabilize Zhixio's illness. It was just that he did not know if there was anyone in Mount Li who had cultivated this method. The iron chains within the clouds were faintly discernible, lightly swaying in the wind. It looked extremely dangerous, but for Chun Changsheng's group, it wasn't a difficult task. It didn't take long for them to cross the bottomless mountain stream and arrive at the opposite mountain peak. Under Yi Xiaoyan's lead, they passed through the precipitous stone path between the cliffs, heading towards the peaks of the north. After walking for an unknown amount of time and passing by several green mountains, they finally saw the main peak of Mount Li in the distance. The main peak of Mount Li was divided into two parts by the clouds. The lower part was covered in lush vegetation, while the mountain above the clouds was completely made of rock. It was like a stone pillar that reached the heavens, sparkling with dazzling rays of light under the sunlight. From a distance, it seemed like a massive sword ready to stab at the heavens at any time. Seeing this stone peak, Chun Changsheng and the others felt a fierce sword intent assaulting their faces. They even had a feeling that the rays of light refracted by this mountain could at any time transform into sword chi that crisscrossed the world. The closer they got to the main peak of Mount Li, the clearer this feeling became. However, they still did not see any flying swords, only the occasional glimmer of sword glows in the depths of the clouds. Through Yi Xiaoyan's introduction, they realized that these were probably the disciples of the various peaks diligently practicing the sword. Chun Changsheng's talent in the way of the sword was extremely high, and his understanding of the Mount Li sword style was extremely profound. Just from the traces of the sword glows, he could determine what sword style the disciples of Mount Li's sword sect in the clouds practiced and what path of the sword they cultivated. His current level of attainment was very admirable. When Zhixio and Tang 36 saw those sword glows, they mostly felt that those sword glows were very dazzling and their sword intents were very fierce, but they were also very open and aboveboard, giving off a feeling of righteousness. They seemed especially youthful and exuberant, full of vitality. Even though there had been many stories between him and the Mount Li sword sect in the past few years, and Tang 36 had never liked them, he had to admit that this made him think of the Orthodox Academy. His favorite, his Orthodox Academy. Zhixio and Chun Changsheng felt the same. They even thought that if they had not entered the Orthodox Academy, coming to Mount Li to cultivate would have been an excellent choice. As they followed the stone path upwards, the terrain gradually became higher. The mountain forest gradually became colder, the leaves gradually became sparse, and the mountain wind gradually became stronger. Much of the clouds were dispersed, and they could gradually see the scenery between the peaks. Sword glows crisscrossed the countless plateaus, and a few secluded caves had disciples sitting cross-legged in front of them, comprehending the sword. Yi Xiaolian explained to them that those caves were often the residences of the elders of Mount Li. Those buildings with red maple leaves were the torture hall, and even higher up were the sword hall. As for the several dozen small white courtyards in the middle of the plateaus, they were the disciples' courtyards. As they walked forward, "What sort of stone is this?" Tang 36 pointed at a square stone that seemed to have been washed by water for tens of thousands of years, its surface extremely smooth. The shape of this square stone did not seem special, but it faintly exuded some sort of sword qi. It was clearly not an ordinary object. Yi Xiaolian replied, "The founder of Mount Li sharpened his sword for 300 years before comprehending the Tao of the sword. It said that this is that sharpening stone." Tang 36 said, "If the rumors are true, then this really is a treasure. I wonder how many crystals we can get if we auction it off in Shualao City." Yi Xiaolian snapped, "What you need to consider is not how much money you can get, but how many days you can survive the full-force pursuit of the Mount Li sword sect." Tang 36 said indifferently, "It was just a joke. There's no need to be so serious." He was prepared to walk forward, but Yi Xiaolian called him back. "This stone is now called the Sword Comprehension Stone. Any cultivator going through the main peak of Mount Li must remove their swords here as a sign of respect." Yi Xiaolian said, "If you walk over like this and something happens, don't blame me for not warning you." Truly arrogant. Tang 36 had never had a good impression of the Mount Li sword sect, and he was also used to being the most arrogant person. He said, "I don't understand, but what can I do?" Yi Xiaolian knew his temper and did not continue to provoke him. "You can also remove your swords, but you need to wait for a Mount Li disciple on the peak to come and receive you." Tang 36 felt that this was very troublesome, but he also did not believe that anything would actually happen, so he just walked over. Chen Changsheng shook his head at this sight. Just as Tang 36 walked over the sword comprehension stone, a sword qi that was not sharp but incomparably mellow suddenly emerged from the stone. The sheath of the Wenshui sword seemed to ripple with light, and then it began to hum. It seemed to be some sort of response, and also seemed to be some sort of explanation. Whoosh, 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 whooshing through the air could be heard as several dozen white lines emerged from the clouds. Several dozen swords quietly floated in the air, their sharp tips aimed at Chen Changsheng's group. Chapter 926. These swords exuded a frigid sword intent that was swift and fierce to the extreme. Even more frightening was the sword energy exuded by these swords. They were like mountains, or perhaps a mountain gate made of stone. Mount Li did not have a mountain gate. The swords were the mountain gate. Tang 36 was not worried about the swords in the air. On the contrary, he found them very interesting. He excitedly said to Chen Changsheng, "This is very similar to your sword style. Could it be that you were born to come to Mount Li to learn the sword?" Zhishou was far more sensitive to danger. He sensed that these swords could unleash a thunderous strike at any moment. He pulled Tang 36 behind him and gripped his sword hilt with his right hand. But he had forgotten that his sword was the demon commander's banner sword. The Mount Li sword sect was a righteous sword sect of the human race, so it was extremely sensitive to the qi exuded by the demon commander's banner sword. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. The sound of something tearing through the air resounded as hundreds of swords flew over from the peak at high speed. Chen Changsheng did not react, but he sensed the power and danger of these several hundred swords. The divine staff appeared on its own, radiating an incomparably bright light. A divine qi enveloped the stone path. The sword comprehension stone was not in the light. All of Mount Li resounded with countless howls. Countless swords broke through the mountains and the clouds, forming a magnificent river of swords that traveled through the mountains and protected the peaks of Mount Li. This was Mount Li's famed myriad sword array. Although the swords in the River of Swords were not as famous as the swords Chen Changsheng had taken from the sword pool, they were sharper and possessed an unstoppable aura. Let alone Chun Chongqing's group. Even if Zhou Dufu and the Tianhai Divine Empress were revived, they would still be incapable of directly resisting this myriad sword array. Fortunately, this river of swords that traversed the heavens only traveled through the mountains and did not immediately attack them. Qin Changsheng and Zhexiu did not sense any killing intent and faintly understood. The former gripped the divine staff while the latter let go of his sword hilt and retreated several steps back. The river of swords was high up in the sky, its awe-inspiring sword intent already descending. At any moment, it could cut everything on the stone path into pieces. It was simply impossible to resist. Tang 36 was rather angry, thinking, Mount Li clearly knows who's coming, but they still insist on doing this. Could it be that they want to give us a show of strength? As Chun Changsheng and the others retreated behind the sword comprehension stone, the hundreds of swords surrounding the stone path became calmer and the vast river of swords gradually slowed down. How preposterous! Tang 36 said to Chun Changsheng, "You are Senior Su Li's direct disciple, so no matter how you look at it, you are still a member of the Mount Li sword sect, even of the same generation as the sect master. These junior disciples actually dared to use the myriad sword array to threaten you. Are you not angry?" Chun Changsheng knew that he must be in a bad mood right now and said helplessly, "Then what do you think I should do?" Tang 36 said, "You should join the Mount Li sword sect as the Pope and then take over as sect master, angering Qiushan Jun and those fellows to death." When he said these words, he spoke very loudly, intentionally wanting the people of Mount Li to hear him. "You rascal, why is your mouth still so cheap?" A familiar voice sounded from the top of the stone path. Tang 36 had bickered with this person many times, so how could he not understand? He sneered, "Could it be that you think what I said is completely impossible?" Guan Feibai walked over from the stone path. He wanted to say a few words of ridicule, but when he thought about how, if Qin Changsheng really did join the Mount Li sword sect, with his status and seniority, Tang 36's seemingly absurd words really might become reality, he couldn't help but slightly change his expression. Just then, a gentle yet dignified voice came from the depths of the clouds. "The presence of Your Holiness the Pope is an honor for all of Mount Li." The speaker was naturally the sect master of the Mount Li sword sect. Guan Feibai restrained his emotions, solemnly bowed to Chun Changsheng, and then led his group into the misty mountains. It didn't take long before they arrived at a stone pavilion halfway up the mountain. Go Hanshi, Liang Banhu, and an elder of the sword hall were waiting for them here. If the Pope had personally come to pay a visit to any other sect, they would presumably have gone out several hundred li to welcome them, and the sect master would certainly have come out to personally welcome them. But today, Chun Changsheng had not arranged a carriage, and the Mount Li sword sect was no ordinary sect. For them to do this in such a hurry was already extremely courteous. Go Hanshi and Liang Banhu first greeted Chun Changsheng. The name of Liang Xiaoxiao had long since been forgotten by the common people, but Qin Changsheng could not forget it, and he was confident that Liang Banhu could not either, so his mood was a little strange. But this mood was quickly shattered by what happened next, because that elder of the sword hall actually gave Chun Changsheng a deep bow. Qin Changsheng was very shocked. It must be known that the elders of the Mount Li sword sect's sword hall were all seniors of profound cultivation and powerful battle prowess. Moreover, they were often stubborn and proud. Even if he was the Pope, logically speaking, they should not have paid such a deep bow. He quickly recalled a matter that Guan Feibai had once told him on the journey. A certain elder of the Mount Li sword sect sword hall was responsible for bringing up the rear in a battle on the snowy plains. He was surrounded and attacked by several demon experts, almost dying. In the end, he had relied on a cinnabar pill to save his life. Now that he thought about it, that incomparably valiant elder of the sword hall was probably the one in front of him. Thinking of this, Chun Changsheng hurriedly helped the elder up and then sternly returned the bow. In his view, only this elder of the sword hall who bathed in blood for the sake of the human race was truly worthy of respect. In comparison, using his blood to make a few cinnabar pills was nothing at all. Without another word, the group ascended to the summit. Several hundred disciples of the Mount Lee Sword sect had already gathered at the summit. Presumably, the sword glows on the other peaks had lessened by now. The Mount Lee Sword sect disciples watched Chun Chongqing's group walk over, their eyes rather curious and wary. Former opponents, competitors, had now become allies, even companions. The relationship between the Mount Lee Sword sect and the Orthodox Academy was extremely complex, so the emotions in those gazes were naturally very complex as well. Interestingly, only a small portion of the gazes of the Lishan Sword sect disciples fell upon Chun Chongsheng, and a small portion fell upon Tang 36, while the majority of the gazes fell upon Zhixio. Moreover, they were discussing something in low voices, appearing to be slightly chaotic. This was naturally not because of Zhixio's illustrious reputation on the battlefield, but because of his relationship with Qi Jian. Go Hanshi slightly creased his brow at this sight. The expressions of the Mount Lee Sword sect disciples abruptly turned solemn, and the sounds of discussion instantly grew much quieter. Passing through the crowd, one could see that cave shrouded in ivy in the distance. Presumably, that was the residence of the Mount Lee Sword sect master. There was a stone plateau in front of the cave, and it was rather high. The figure standing there was very easy to see. Of course, even if one stood in a crowd of tens of thousands, that person would still be the first to be seen. Qiushan Jun turned around and looked at Chun Chongqing's group. Chun Chongqing looked at him, not knowing what to say. Yesterday, when he had decided to come to Mount Lee, he had naturally imagined this scene. He had originally believed that Qiushan Jun would find some excuse to avoid him, but only now did he understand that if he avoided him, would he still be Qiushan Jun? Chapter 9:27. The summit was extremely quiet. Zhixio, Tang 36, and the other disciples of the Mount Lee Sword sect silently watched the pair. The most famous of the younger generation of cultivators were naturally Qiushan Jun and Su Yurong, and only later on did Chun Chongqing's name appear. The relationship between the three was extremely complicated, and this story could be told for a very long time. But as far as the common people knew, Chun Chongqing and Qiushan Jun had never met. The entire continent was very curious as to what would happen if they met for the first time. Today, they had finally met. What would happen next? Qiushan Jun calmly bowed. Your journey has been arduous. Chun Chongqing calmly returned the bow. Long time no see. In Wenshui City, Qiushan Jun had walked past him, but they had not truly met. This meant that this was their first meeting after parting at the Mount Song Army headquarters. The Mount Lee Sword sect disciples were rather perplexed at Chun Chongqing's words, thinking, could it be that eldest brother and the Pope have met before? Zhixio and Tang 36 glanced at each other, also rather surprised. Yi Xiaoyan was not thinking about these things. Her gaze moved back and forth between Qiushan Jun and Chun Chongqing, intoxicated. She thought to herself, once we return to the temple, how should I show off to my junior sisters? Only Go Hanshi and the others who had followed Qiushan Jun back to the mountain yesterday knew that these two had spent some time together in Sloping Cliff Horse Farm. As they thought of this matter and saw this scene, Go Hanshi and the others all had rather strange expressions, while Bai Kai was having a hard time stifling his laughter. Tang 36 was very curious and walked over without any regard for himself, asking just what was going on. Upon learning the answer, he was speechless. Looking at Qiushan Jun and Chun Chongqing, he sighed, Are the two of you blind? Qiushan Jun asked, You are Tang Tang. You recognize me? Tang 36 asked in surprise. He thought to himself that a person like Qiushan Jun would actually recognize him, which made him rather proud, but soon after, he was annoyed by this pride. I heard that when you came out of the ancestral hall, you stank to no end. Now it seems that you forgot to rinse your mouth while bathing on the street. Qiushan Jun shook his head, indicating that Chun Chongqing should follow him into the dwelling. Tang 36 was enraged by these words. He no longer cared that Qiushan Jun was Qiushan Jun or that this was the Mount Lee Sword sect. He rolled up his sleeves and prepared to engage in a verbal battle. Go Hanshi hurriedly pulled him back and advised, Senior Marshal Brother is in a bad mood today. You should be more understanding. These words were true. Even though Qiu Jun wasn't a gentle gentleman like Gohan Sure, he was still quite generous, and rarely would he say such sharp and sarcastic words. Tang 36 looked at the closed stone door of the cave and laughed. So even Qiu Jun would get angry from embarrassment. As the two most extraordinary people of a younger generation of cultivators, they naturally couldn't help but feel embarrassed that they had once done such a stupid thing. His most embarrassing past was exposed in front of everyone, and he was even unceremoniously called blind. Naturally, he felt very embarrassed, and because of many reasons, the relationship between Chun Changsheng and Qiu Jun was already very awkward. Therefore, the two of them did not speak until they reached the depths of the cave. "Master, His Holiness the Pope has arrived." After saying this, Qiu Jun walked to the side and sat down. A Taoist sat on a cattail hassock, his head lowered as he read a book that looked like a sword manual. He seemed extremely focused, and only his hair could be seen. Chun Changsheng knew that this was the sect master of the Mount Li Sword sect and subconsciously turned to him. At this moment, the Mount Li Sword sect master also raised his head, and the two's gazes met. Chun Changsheng realized that although the sect master had a head of white hair, his eyes were extremely clear and penetrating, devoid of any sense of age. Instead, they had a fresh and clear look. Such a fresh and penetrating look gave off an unfathomable feeling. Chun Changsheng's expression changed. He felt that this Grandmaster of the Sword was not someone who had just recently entered the divine domain. Before Junior Martial Uncle left, I had already crossed that threshold. The Mount Li Sword sect master saw his confusion and smiled. But there's nothing to announce about this matter. I'm not like those storms of the past who needed to confer vast tracts of fertile land for the disciples of my clan. Moreover, attending a ceremony is very troublesome, so I did not let the world know. Chun Changsheng asked. Then why? He naturally wanted to ask why the Mount Li Sword sect had suddenly announced this matter to the world a few days ago. The Mount Li Sword sect master replied, "The Prince of Xiang broke through this threshold. If I still did not stand up, I'm afraid that the hearts of the people would become unsteady." Chun Changsheng understood what he meant and gratefully said, "Many thanks, Senior." The Mount Li Sword sect master replied, "It's just an empty reputation and empty power, but Your Holiness the Pope must know that this old Taoist is most afraid of trouble. If there is nothing important, I will absolutely not leave the mountain." Chun Changsheng replied, "If there is no need, I will definitely not disturb Senior's quiet cultivation." The Mount Li Sword sect master asked, "If you do not wish to disturb my quiet cultivation, why would Your Holiness be sitting in front of me?" Chun Changsheng was somewhat embarrassed. But that matter still has to be resolved. The Mount Li Sword sect master smirked at him. "Has that wolf child's illness been cured?" Chun Changsheng shook his head. "Not only has it not been cured, it's even showing signs of worsening." The Mount Li Sword sect master sighed. "This being the case, it's better not to meet." Chun Changsheng said, "Besides meeting, we have come to Mount Li this time to seek medical treatment." The Mount Li Sword sect master asked, "What is the meaning of this?" Chun Changsheng explained Zhixio's illness, then continued, "I once saw a record in the Taoist canon. It said that the Mount Li Sword sect once had a Taoist technique that contained clear, righteous, and wondrous sounds within the path of the sword. It was the most neutral and peaceful, and I believe that this Taoist technique can help Zhixio temporarily control his tide rush of blood." The Mount Li Sword sect master slightly narrowed his eyes. "Your Holiness's meaning is that you want that wolf child to learn the Taoist technique of my Mount Li Sword sect?" Chun Changsheng replied, "Correct. I ask Senior to fulfill this request." The Mount Li Sword sect master said, "I have heard of the Taoist technique of the just sword clear sound, but it has been lost for many years." Chun Changsheng also knew of this matter, but he still held onto one last hope. He said, if the 2 scores of sword sound were still here, perhaps he could learn the proper technique. The Mount Li Sword sect master smiled without saying anything, but he seemed to inadvertently close the book that he had been intently reading. Chun Changsheng's gaze fell on the cover of the book, and he was very astonished. So this was the 2 scores of the just sword clear sound. The Mountly sword sect master smiled. The just sword clear sound truly has been lost. I only began learning it yesterday, so I can't be sure when I'll be able to learn it. How could Qin Changsheng not know that the Mountly sword sect had long since made arrangements for this matter? He clasped his hands deeply to the Mountly sword sect master and said with a sincere expression, "Many thanks for Senior's help." To have an expert of the divine domain in the path of the sword continue the legacy of the just sword clear sound and then pass it on to Zhixio was naturally countless times better than Zhixio cultivating with a sword manual. The Mountly sword sect master smiled, but he did not respond. Chapter 928. Qin Changsheng's talent in cultivation was extremely high, but his wisdom in the secular world was very ordinary. He stared blankly for a long time before reacting, and then very seriously thought for a period of time before saying, "If there's an opportunity, I will naturally persuade His Majesty the White Emperor to return the fundamental method of Mountly sword style." Several hundred years ago, when the allied armies of humans and demi-humans attacked the demons from the north, several elders of the Mountly sword sect lost the opportunity to transport supplies and were sentenced to death. The Mountly sword sect had no choice but to send the fundamental manual of the sword art to the White Emperor city. Only then did the White Emperor issue an imperial edict to force Jin Yulu to relent. To the Mountly sword sect, if they could take back the secrets of the Mountly sword style without falling out with White Emperor city, this was naturally an extremely good thing. And now, the person most likely to accomplish this was obviously Qin Changsheng. Hearing Qin Changsheng's promise, the sect master of Mountly sword sect was very satisfied. Qiu Jun raised his eyebrows slightly, a little dissatisfied. His martial granduncle, Su Li, had once said that the things that Mountly had lost should naturally be taken back by Mountly itself. But since it was the sect master's will, he couldn't very well oppose it in front of Qin Changsheng. Having resolved the greatest problem of Zhixio's illness, Qin Changsheng's mood was much better. He said, "Can you let them meet now?" The Mountly sword sect master shook his head and said, "Even if that wolf child learns the clear voice of the righteous sword, he can only temporarily suppress his illness. He can't be considered cured, so he naturally can't meet." Qin Changsheng felt helpless and said, "Why do you have to do this?" The Mountly sword sect master also felt very helpless. "This is Junior Martial Uncle's will. Who dares to disobey?" Qin Changsheng thought of Su Li's personality and was also speechless. Qiu Jun suddenly said, "I think Martial Granduncle made a mistake in this matter." The Mountly sword sect master replied, "But he is still your Martial Granduncle. You must respect and love him." Qiu Jun said, "With Martial Granduncle's temperament, it's really hard for people to respect and love him." Qin Changsheng thought of the scenes that happened on the way back from the snowy plains. He glanced at Qiu Jun and knew what he was thinking. At this moment, they felt like they had returned to Sloping Cliff Horse Farm. But it was only for a moment. Soon, they felt uncomfortable again and looked away. Is there really no other way to bend the rules? Qin Changsheng asked the Mountly sword sect master. In any case, Senior Su Li isn't here right now. The Mountly sword sect master said, "Although Junior Martial Uncle has left, the sword is still in the mountain." Qin Changsheng heard the hidden meaning in this sentence and asked, "Sword?" The Mountly sword sect master replied, "Junior Martial Uncle left behind a sword. If someone can defeat this sword, they can disregard his decree." Qin Changsheng thought about it and said, "I want to try. I don't want to lie to you. It's very dangerous to break that sword." The Mountly sword sect master sternly said, "Junior Martial Uncle is your teacher on the path of the sword, so you can be considered my junior brother. I do not wish for you to take such risks." Qin Changsheng said, "I am still young. I really don't dare to accept." He was referring to the title of junior brother. The Mountly sword sect master smiled. It truly was a slip of the tongue. Even if you dared to agree, I would not dare to actually call you this, or else someone would be unhappy. If Qin Changsheng became the junior of the sect leader of Lishan sword sect, then wouldn't he become the martial uncle of Qiu Jun and the other 7 laws of divine state? As for who would be unhappy, It was obvious without even asking. Chen Chong Sheng glanced at Xiao Shan. Xiao Shan Jun ignored him and looked at the Mount Li sword sect master. If Junior's sister were to hear these words, "Master, how many strands of your beard would be left?" There was a plateau behind the main peak of Mount Li. In front of the plateau was a stone wall covered in green vines, and between the vines were a few wildflowers. Only by walking closer could one clearly see that between the green vines, there was a path about 2 feet wide in the stone wall. One could faintly hear the crisp cries of birds coming from the other end of the stone wall, as well as the fragrance of flowers. If one looked carefully, one could even see green everywhere. There seemed to be a verdant valley on the other side. Xiao Shanjun, Gohan Shi, and the other disciples of Mount Li led Chun Chongsheng's party to stand in front of the plateau. Zhishou looked at the crack in the stone wall in silence. Junior's sister has been quietly cultivating over there for the past few years. If you want to see her, you have to walk through here. Gohan Shi said to Chun Chongsheng and the others. This stone path was created when Marshal Granduncle used the sword in his hand to cut through the cliff before he broke into the divine. The stone wall is filled with sword intent and murderous intent, making it extremely dangerous. And this is also the sword that you need to break through. Qin Chongsheng was well aware that after the heaven-shrouding sword was lost in the Garden of Zhou, Su Li had always used an ordinary steel sword forged by a smithy in a small village at the base of Mount Li. When he thought about how this person had used such an ordinary sword to cut out a world in the cliff, he couldn't help but be shocked speechless. His gaze fell on the stone path and the green vines. The stone wall was covered in countless sword slashes, all of them extremely deep. Even after several centuries of wind and rain, they still had not been erased. At this moment, he was still 10 some zhang from the stone wall, but he could already clearly sense the sharp sword intent contained in those sword slashes. Bai Kai, Tang 36, and the others glanced at the stone wall a few more times. They even felt a stabbing pain in their eyes and wanted to cry. Zhishou had been staring at the stone wall the entire time, silent and abnormally focused. His eyes gradually reddened, but he still did not blink. A gust of wind blew in from the cliff, ruffling the fallen leaves on the ground and lifting up Chun Chongsheng's clothes. There was a soft, tearing sound, and a straight tear appeared on his clothes. A corner of his clothes drifted in the wind and fell off the cliff. Chun Chongsheng lowered his head to look at the floor of the cliff. He saw that the ground within a radius of 10 zhang from the entrance to the stone wall was extremely smooth, without even a single leaf. Presumably, the sharp sword intent in the stone wall had seeped out with the passage of time, chopping all the fallen leaves and gravel into pieces. Such awe-inspiring and terrifying sword intent was truly rare in the world. He truly deserved to be called the strongest expert of the sword in the last 1,000 years. Zhishou moved, but he was stopped by Chun Chongsheng. I learned the sword from Su Li, so I have a deep understanding of his path of the sword. You should let me try first. Even if I can't pass, I should still have a chance to retreat. What you need to do is observe. With your ability to observe and analyze battle, your chances of success will be much higher. Qin Chongsheng looked into his eyes and seriously said. His words were correct. Although they only needed to walk through this path covered in sword slashes, it was still an extremely arduous battle. This was a battle between them and Su Li from several hundred years ago. After a moment of silence, Zhishou stopped and said, "Thank you." There were many things that did not need to be said. Given Zhishou's personality, a single word of thanks was enough to explain many things. Chun Chongsheng took out the stainless sword, flipped the hilt, and combined it with the vault sheath. This was the strongest form of his sword. When he faced Zhu Luo in Xuanyang City, when he charged alone into the alley of the Northern Military Department in the capital, and when he faced off against 2 generations of demon lords in the snowy mountains, he had done this. Today, he was going to charge through the stone path, and he was similarly facing a powerful foe. The Su Li of several hundred years ago, when he cut open this heavenly passage, had not yet entered the divine domain, much less become as powerful as he would later become. However, his cultivation in the path of the sword had already reached an extremely formidable level. To the current him in Juxiu, he was still an existence that was difficult to reach. Chen Changsheng raised his sword and took a step forward. With this single step, several tears appeared on his clothes. Chapter 9:29. He was quiet for a while, then he took another step forward. The chilly mountain wind ruffled the hair in front of his face and then drifted down. A fierce and invisible sword intent was born with the wind and silently arrived. This time, he was quiet for an even longer time. He needed to make a choice. Would he use the star radiance in his 365 chi openings to form a star domain to resist, or would he use his sword intent to resist? In the end, he chose the latter, because Su Li was his teacher on the path of the sword. Today, he naturally had to use the path of the sword to challenge his opponent. Only this could be considered a satisfactory answer sheet. Countless sword intents left their sheaths and arrived on the plateau. The chi of these sword intents were not the same, seeming rather jumbled, but miraculously, there was no conflict between them. On the contrary, they seemed exceptionally harmonious. Go Hanshi was slightly moved by this sight, a look of praise appearing in his eyes. No matter how high Chen Changsheng's cultivation in the path of the sword was, his sword intent was still not as pure as Su Li's. In terms of quality, it was very difficult for him to defeat his opponent. So he chose to use quantity to make up for the lack of quality. This seemed very ordinary, but upon closer thought, it was extremely unusual. Besides him, who else in the world could simultaneously possess so many sword intents and so freely control them? Suddenly, the plateau resounded with countless soft, scraping sounds. The mountain wind abruptly vanished, but the ivy on the stone wall began to sway. The ivy that had coexisted with the sword intents for centuries was naturally unaffected by the assault of the sword intents. But now, they began to break apart and fall. It was clearly impossible to see anything, but there seemed to be countless swords silently contending in front of the stone wall. Countless sword intents were engaged in the most minute contest within an extremely small area. The chi of the world grew awe-inspiring, and even the light in the sky suddenly grew much gloomier. Chen Changsheng walked up to the ivy. The ivy shattered into pieces, revealing the entrance to the path in the stone wall. Without the slightest hesitation, he walked in. The battle of sword intents was still continuing behind him. Countless cracks and white turbulence appeared in the air around the entrance to the path, obscuring the scene within. After a while, swords began to cry out from the stone wall. The path in the stone wall was very narrow, the sky extremely high above cut into a line. As Chen Changsheng walked through it, his vision was rather gloomy. The stone wall was covered in perfectly straight sword slashes, the ends extremely thin and the middle somewhat thick. They seemed very smooth and round, but they were also extremely sharp. Every sharp sword mark represented a sword intent. The sword intents emerged from the stone walls, slashing towards Chen Changsheng's face with incomparable sharpness. At the same time, they invaded his ethereal palace and sea of consciousness. Chen Changsheng didn't show any signs of panic. His footsteps were extremely steady, and his sword was placed horizontally in front of his body, so close to his eyebrows that it resembled an iron chain. This was the third sword that Su Li had passed on to him, the stupid sword. This sword technique focused on one's temperament. With Chen Changsheng's firm and steady temperament, when used in his hands, it could be said to be as firm as a boulder. Pa, 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 countless crisp cries of swords rang out in the stone path. It sounded like two swords were constantly colliding. In front of Chen Changsheng's eyes was the horizontal blade of the sword. The edges of the blade were filled with flying sparks, and the stone walls on both sides were instantly added with dozens of new sword marks. His sword blocked the tangible sword intent, but he could not stop the invisible sword intent from invading his body. As he went deeper and deeper into the stone path, that awe-inspiring feeling grew thicker and thicker. His sea of consciousness was already surging with countless waves, which were then chopped into bubbles by those sword intents. As these bubbles appeared and then disappeared, His eyes began to feel a stabbing pain, and the cutting sensation on his skin became even more distinct. These sword intents were the true test. Unless one had a firm will and a tranquil spiritual sense, it was simply impossible to endure. Chen Changsheng held his sword horizontally in front of him and continued forward. The entrance to the path was extremely narrow, but gradually widened as he walked, but this did not mean that it was easier to walk. On the contrary, the sword marks on the stone walls grew denser and denser. The sword chi that appeared more and more majestic, the sword intents more and more awe-inspiring. Even more frightening was that the sword marks gradually formed some sort of connection, coming in an endless stream. Each sword mark was a sword, and if they could be connected, they would form a complete set of sword techniques. At this moment, Chen Changsheng finally began to truly confront Su Li's cultivation in the path of the sword. An incomparably awe-inspiring sword intent seeped out of the stone walls, obscuring the sunlight above his head and that smear of green in the distance. It surged over like a vast ocean. Chen Changsheng's body swayed, and he almost lost his footing. His face also paled somewhat. If he had not experienced the tempering of this ocean of sword intent countless times in the vault sheath, he would probably have already been defeated. How could he pass through this vast ocean of sword intent? How could he break Su Li's sword techniques? Chen Changsheng attentively listened to the dense sounds of sword intents tearing through the air, calmly gazing at the cracks the sword intents had left in the air, sensing the minute changes in the sword intents. His eyes were just like before, still as clean as a small stream, without a speck of dust. They reflected the flowing clouds in the sky, and the sword glows flitting through them. His sword was no longer held horizontally in front of his eyes, but straight up in the air. The stupid sword could only defend, so how could he break the sword techniques Su Li had left behind? Of course, he could only use sword techniques. A sword glow tore through the air, shattering a sword chi descending from the sky. This was the Heavenly Tao Academy's sword of hithering light, so fast that not even the heavens could grasp it. Several sword flowers trembled as they appeared in the mountain winds, blocking the sword of the sea and sky descending from above. The sword shadows were divided into 13, each one a willow branch. They seemed weak, but they were extremely tenacious. No matter how the sword fell into the mountain, it would still be able to endure. There was also blossoming flowers, mountain ghosts splitting the cliff, law swords murderous, revolving mountain also welcoming guests, and finally, scorching heaven rising. These were all sword styles of Mount Li, so they could naturally break your Mount Li sword style. There was also the Orthodox Academy's toppling mountain staff and true sword. He was the Pope and also the principal of the Orthodox Academy, so he naturally had a divine aura accompanying him. It was just like when he faced Su Yorong's sword of great light on the bridge of helplessness. Chen Changsheng displayed all the sword styles he had learned in his life. The sword glows illuminated the gloomy path. Countless famous, unknown, or extremely unorthodox sword techniques appeared in his hands. Time slowly passed. Chen Changsheng gripped his sword and advanced. After some time, he finally reached the end of the path. Even though countless sword glows obscured his vision and sword intents were dense and glaring, he could still clearly make out the verdant valley beyond the path. Yet it seemed like he could only walk up to this point. He had used all the sword styles he had learned in his life, but he still had not been able to break all the sword techniques on the stone wall. Only now did he understand one thing. In terms of cultivation in the path of the sword, it could be said that few people in the world could compare to him, and there was certainly no one who knew more sword styles than him. But today, he was facing Su Li. Su Li knew even more sword styles than him, and his sword intent was many times more condensed and powerful. Su Li was his teacher on the path of the sword, so how could he surpass him on the path of the sword? Chen Changsheng stopped and put down the sword in his hand. Those sword intents sensed his mood and also stopped their attacks. They quietly floated in the air between the stone walls, waiting for his decision. Retreat or continue forward. Chapter 9:30. Those sword intents were very quiet, still not lacking in their awe-inspiring quality. Even if one used spiritual sense to sense them, one could still be injured. Shaken by the previous sword battle, a stone above the stone wall loosened and rolled down. However, it did not fall to the ground. While it was still in the air, it was cut into countless pieces by the invisible sword intent. Finally, it turned into the finest powder and was blown away by the mountain wind into the green valley outside the exit, never to be seen again. Qin Changsheng gazed at this scene in silence for a very long time. Then, he lowered his head and seriously pondered for a very long time. He was recalling those scenes of Su Li passing on the sword in the wilderness, as well as a few things that had happened later on. Before Su Li took the Holy Maiden to the sacred light continent, he had left a few letters for the world. One letter had severed the last of the longevity sect's courage. One letter had cut off one of Zhu Luo's arms. These letters were naturally extremely precious and frightening objects. Qin Changsheng had obtained two. From this, one could see that Su Li truly valued him, even treating him as a legacy disciple. These two letters had saved Qin Changsheng's life twice, and at the same time, they had greatly increased his cultivation on the path of the sword. The path was now filled with sword intents, condensed and unreleased, but they were the sharpest existences in the world, capable of cutting through all things. This made him recall the scene when he had opened Su Li's letter in the kitchen of the Orthodox Academy. At the time, he had stood amidst these sword intents, not daring to move. Now, he could only remain motionless. Was this as far as he could go? Qin Changsheng suddenly recalled that before leaving, Su Li had also left a letter for Qiu Shanjun. But Qiu Shanjun had not taken it. Perhaps this was the gap between him and Qiu Shanjun. Back in the wilderness, when Su Li had passed on the sword to him, he had said that he was very good, only a little lacking to Qiu Shan. When they parted in Xuanyang City, Wang Pa had also said that he was very good, only a little lacking to Qiu Shan. From Xining to the capital, he had heard similar words many times. At the very beginning, in the discussions of others, the gap between him and Qiu Shanjun was as vast as the heavens and the earth. Later on, this gap had gradually shrunk, but even though he was now the Pope and Qiu Shanjun was still an ordinary disciple of the Mount Li Sword sect and had even vanished for 5 years, there was still no one who said that he had surpassed Qiu Shan. Qin Changsheng looked at those sword intents that were actually invisible, as if he were looking at Su Li himself. I still want to try. He wanted to see if he could take another step forward until he walked out of this stone passage. He wanted to try and prove to Su Li that his choice to pass on the sword to him was correct. He wanted to try and prove to the heavens and earth that he might not be stronger than Qiu Shanjun, but he wasn't weaker than him either, at least in some aspects. Once he made up his mind, he calmed his breathing. At this moment, his state of mind was clear, like a sword that had been washed by water for countless years. Countless swords flew out of their scabbards silently, like fish leaping out of the pond, about to become dragons. Countless sword lights illuminated the gloomy cliff, taking away all the colors between heaven and earth as they slashed towards those incomparably powerful sword wills. The crisp and clear sword chimes rang out, gradually forming a line, like the line between the sea and the sky. Then, it suddenly became silent. The people on the cliff plateau had been nervously watching the movements in the passage. Green vines obstructed his line of sight, and sword wills disrupted the light in the sky. He could not clearly see what was going on inside, but he could vaguely see those sword lights. Suddenly, the sword lights flourished, making it impossible to see anything clearly. The swords clattered, making it impossible to hear anything else. All they could see was the howling of the mountain winds, stirring up countless fragments of stone and dust that constantly clashed and struggled in the passage like a living dragon. Seeing this sight and feeling the tremors coming from the cliff, those ordinary disciples of the Mount Li Sword sect paled. They thought in shock, His Holiness is truly worthy of being Martial Granduncle Su Li's legacy disciple. His cultivation in the path of the sword is truly as powerful as the rumors say. Could it be that he really can make it through? Somewhat worried, Bai Kai asked, is he prepared to destroy this stone passage? After Chen Changsheng began to use his sword to break through the wall, Qiu Shanjun had maintained his silence, his expression unchanged. He seemed extremely calm. Only now did a serious expression finally appear on his face for the first time. If he can destroy this stone passage, then it naturally counts as a success. This stone passage was the true cliff of Mount Li's main peak. Back then, Su Li had used an unimaginable sword might to cleave open a path, and in the several hundred years that followed, sword slashes had constantly appeared on the stone walls. Sword intent had seeped into the cliff, making it incomparably tough. Even the treasures of the orthodoxy would find it very difficult to destroy, so Qin Chongqing naturally did not have this ability. But he walked out. After an unknown period of time, he finally walked out of the stone tunnel and arrived at the meadow outside the exit. His clothes were riddled with holes, and his hair band had been torn at some point. His black hair scattered behind his back, making him seem rather miserable. Blood flowed out of his clothes, but it gradually faded with a gentle breeze. Fortunately, after the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, he had already grasped a few techniques, preventing any strange changes from occurring. He was born without filth, his spiritual sense tranquil and powerful to the extreme, his meditation efficiency extremely high, his star radiance abundant. He had bathed in the true blood of the black frost dragon while in meditation, and when he condensed his star domain, he had simultaneously lit up 365 chi openings. It could be said that he possessed the world's most perfect cultivating body. But today he had suffered so many injuries. Besides his body covered in sword slashes, his face also had several extremely fine wounds, and a small part of his left eyebrow had been cut off. If the wound had been just a little off, it would have injured his eye. From this, one could imagine just how dangerous the situation had been, and just how terrifying the sword intense Su Li had left on the stone walls had been. Standing on the stone path and gazing at the verdant valley and cloudless blue sky, Qin Chongsheng felt extremely carefree. Today, when confronting the sword intense Su Li had left behind, he had displayed everything he had learned in his life. He had held nothing back, had no need to hide anything. This was not the most dangerous battle he had ever fought in his cultivation, but it was the most delightful battle. Countless sword styles have been displayed to their heart's content, cleaving apart the stone path and the world, and also broadening his mind. He even wanted to yell a few times at the verdant valley and blue sky, but this was somewhat inconsistent with his personality. In the end, he did not yell, but turned to look at the stone path. He had already walked past the stone path, so he naturally knew that not all the sword intents and moves on the stone walls had been left behind by Su Li when he broke open the heavenly passage. Many of them had been left behind by Su Li later on, and some had probably been left behind by the people of the Mount Li sword sect. He looked at the stone path in silence for a very long time. He seemed to see a few scenes. In the past several hundred years, Su Li would occasionally return to the mountain, and he would come here and seemingly casually slash at the stone walls. Those elders of the sword hall with profound cultivations in the path of the sword would hold their swords and think hard, all for the sake of advancing a step further. Occasionally, they would gain something and also slash at the stone path. In the past several hundred years, the essence of Su Li's path of the sword was contained here, as was the spirit and will of the Mount Li sword sect. This stone path was the place that the disciples of the Mount Li sword sect used to temper their sword hearts. When Su Li had left his daughter in this verdant valley, he had assuredly thought that Chen Chongsheng and Zheshio would try to walk this stone path. In other words, this was the final lesson he had left for Chen Chongsheng. Chapter 9:31. What about Zheshio? Chen Chongsheng thought to himself. Could it be that Su Li had forced Zheshio to walk this stone path brimming with sword intent just to teach him a lesson? Or perhaps this was the father-in-law's test for his son-in-law. My father isn't as good as you think. He just doesn't want Zheshio to see me. In reality, he definitely didn't think that you would actually be able to force your way through. Hearing the noise, Chen Chongsheng turned around. Then he saw Qi Jian, whom he had not seen for many years. That year in the Mausoleum of Books, and later in the Garden of Zhou, He had gotten to know Qi Jian as a thin, small, and somewhat timid little boy. As a result, even though he had long since known of her true identity, when he saw her dressed in a blue dress, it still took him a very long time to come to his senses. "Long time no see," Chen Changsheng said to her. Qi Jian pushed her messy hair behind her ear and said, "How many years has it been? I don't know the passage of time in the mountains, and I'm too lazy to remember the days." The current her was a cheerful young girl, even healthier than when she was young. She didn't have the gloomy feeling that Chen Changsheng had previously imagined. Chen Changsheng looked around and found that the green valley was lush with vegetation. In the distance, there was a waterfall and a pool of water. The sound of birds chirping was incessant, and the scenery was extremely beautiful. But even if he was in the celestial realm, being imprisoned here all year round was extremely bitter. As he thought of this matter and listened to her words, his dissatisfaction with Su Li and all of Mount Li grew even stronger. Seeing his expression, Qi Jian softly said, "Your Holiness the Pope, have you perhaps misunderstood something?" Chen Changsheng was slightly startled and asked, "Are you not imprisoned here?" Qi Jian said, "These past few years, I have indeed been quietly cultivating my sword techniques here." Chen Changsheng said, "Then why do you need to explain for your sect? It's not easy to get in and out of this place." Thinking of the dangerous sword wills and the stone wall and the mountain gate, he still had a lingering fear. If he had to endure this kind of test every day, no matter how beautiful the scenery was, he would not be willing to come here. Qi Jian knew that he was concerned about him and smiled. "Other than what you did, there are naturally other ways." Chen Changsheng was slightly startled. He thought to himself, "Is there another way out?" He asked, "Then can you go out now?" "He's over there." Qi Jian's smile faded, and he calmly and firmly said, "If he really wants to see me, he can naturally come and see me." Chen Changsheng vaguely understood the meaning of this sentence, but he couldn't be sure. The dragon-like smoke and dust gradually dispersed. The sunlight shone on the cliff platform again, and the stone path returned to true quietness. Everyone's expression was slightly apprehensive. They didn't know what was going on inside. Zhishio gazed in that direction, silent and pensive. Qiushan Jun said, "He went over." Hearing this, Guan Feibai glanced at the sky and revealed an expression of shock. It only took 3/4 of an hour. Tang 36 didn't know how difficult the stone path was, but seeing Guan Feibai's reaction, he knew that Chen Changsheng used very little time. Tang 36 said proudly, "Don't you think that his sword art was personally taught by your martial granduncle? This stone path is nothing to him." Bai Kai sneered. When eldest brother crossed this stone path 5 years ago, it only took him half an hour. At these words, Zhishio glanced at Qiushan Jun. Tang 36 was also somewhat shocked. Qiushan Jun's reputation had long ago spread throughout the world, but very few people had ever seen him fight, not even Zhishio or Tang 36. In truth, they had always wanted to know. Everyone said that Qiushan Jun was very strong, but just how strong was he? That shout in Wenshui City and those paintings on Holy Maiden Peak proved that Qiushan Jun truly was extraordinary, but in the end, it was not cultivation or battle. Only now did they realize that this person truly was very strong. 5 years ago, Qiushan Jun was a little younger than Chen Changsheng, and his cultivation was probably slightly inferior, but he had actually used half an hour to cross this stone path. "Go Hanshi said, seeing your brother has been learning the sword in the mountains since he was a child. This isn't his first time attempting the path of the sword, so he naturally has to take advantage." The Mount Li Sword sect disciples knew of their second brother's style of conduct, so they were not surprised to see him speak up for Chen Changsheng. Instead, it was Tang 36 who didn't know how to respond. Zhishio paid no attention to their conversation and walked straight towards the stone path. The sword intense, seeping out of the vines from the stone walls, drifted down onto his body, instantly ripping apart his clothes. But he did not care, his expression not even changing. The gazes of the Mount Li Sword sect disciples and Tang 36 all fell on his body. Many people had already guessed that Chun Changsheng would probably be able to cross this stone path, because he had originally cultivated the path of the Sword of Mount Li. Then what about this wolf expert who had been infamous for his viciousness since he was a child? He was the true main character of this matter. To Chun Changsheng, crossing the stone path was a battle. To Zhexiu, crossing the stone path was a hunt. From a certain perspective, his body truly did have a very primitive aura. As a hybrid of human and demi-human, his body was as tough as steel, his talent for comprehension was extremely high, his intelligence was extremely high, his spiritual sense was extremely powerful, and his true essence was abundant. As the strange illness of the tide rush of blood worsened, his meridians grew thicker and thicker, his spiritual sense more berserk, and the amount of true essence in his body increased steeply. Just like some monsters in the plains of the north, when they were on the verge of death, they would become incomparably powerful. Zhexiu was currently very powerful, and when Chun Changsheng crossed the stone path, he was like a true beast, constantly observing, not missing a single detail. He had confirmed that he had found his prey's weakness, so he needed to conserve all his strength in unnecessary consumption, lunge forward, and bite through his opponent's throat. Pulling away the ivy, he walked into the stone path. He gazed at the sword intent that blotted out the heavens and earth, but he did not assume any fighting stance. He said, "I didn't come to learn this sword from you, nor do I want to prove that I'm stronger than you. I just came to see her, and no one can stop me." These words were said to the sword slashes on the stone wall. Naturally, he wanted to say them to the owner of the sword slashes. Countless sword cries soared into the sky, seeming to be extremely angry, but not long after, these sword cries disappeared. The stone path was quiet. Whether it was Tang 36 and the others on the plateau, or Chun Changsheng on the other side of the cliff, they were all extremely nervous. After waiting for a very long time, there were no more sword cries. Chun Changsheng understood and said, "This is the method?" Qi Jian calmly said, "The sword is connected to the spirit and cannot be tricked. As long as the heart is sincere, it can send a message. Since it's not an enemy, why stop me?" Chun Changsheng said, "Then what about the sword cries from before? They seemed even more berserk than the ones I encountered." Qi Jian slightly pursed his lips. He seemed unconcerned, but in reality, he was very nervous. The footsteps grew closer and closer. Zhexiu walked out of the stone path. Chapter 9:32. Zhexiu's appearance was even more miserable than Chun Changsheng's. His body that was as hard as metal and stone was covered in wounds and dust. Chun Changsheng took a handkerchief from his sleeve and handed it over. He curiously asked, "How did you get here?" Zhexiu expressionlessly replied, "I didn't retaliate when hit, didn't retaliate when cursed, just walked forward." Chun Changsheng asked, "You could even do that?" Zhexiu replied, "Or he could just kill me." Chun Changsheng said, "That doesn't match your personality." Zhexiu replied, "It can be changed." Ever since he was a child, he had been viewed as a demon and expelled from his tribe. He struggled between life and death, struggling to survive. Zhexiu had never been a person who cared about the gazes of others, and he certainly didn't know how to write the word flexible. His personality was cold and hard to the extreme. But for some things, he was willing to change himself, even if he had to go against his heart and his most powerful habits. For example, at this moment, he took the handkerchief from Chun Changsheng and earnestly wiped the dirt off his face. After a while, he very seriously asked Chun Changsheng, "Have you wiped it clean?" Chun Changsheng looked for a while, then said, "It's not bad." Zhexiu glanced at his clothes that had been torn by sword intent and said, "I know that you carry a lot of clothes with you. Lend me a set." When I had nothing to do, I made a few sets of clothes. In a little while, you can see if they fit. Qi Jian's voice came from behind Chun Changsheng. Her voice was very soft, trembling. Chun Changsheng stepped aside. Zhexiu froze at the sight of the girl dressed in a blue dress. Qi Jian looked at him, somewhat nervous. All was quiet. It had been many years since they had last met. Somewhat unfamiliar, somewhat unaccustomed. He was still the same. She had already become a big girl. Qi Jian raised her skirt and bowed. As Su Li's daughter, the sect master's last disciple, she was the junior sister with the most special status in Mount Li. She very rarely bowed to people, so her movements were rather clumsy. Zhixiu clasped his hands in return, his movements even more stiff, as he had never bowed to anyone before. The atmosphere was also rather stiff. The two were quiet for a very long time, not knowing what to say. "I don't have much time," Zhixiu suddenly said. Qi Jian knew that his condition was worsening, so she couldn't help but feel a little angry. But Zhixiu continued, "So I want to treasure my time even more." Startled, Qi Jian asked, "What do you want to do?" Zhixiu looked at her and earnestly said, "I want to hug you." Qi Jian's face turned red, not knowing how to respond. Zhixiu somewhat clumsily spread out his arms. Qi Jian wanted to cry and said, "I want you to carry me." Zhixiu turned around and squatted down in front of her. Qi Jian leaned in, hugged his neck tightly, and then began to cry. "Don't cry." Zhixiu felt uneasy. Qi Jian felt wronged and said, "I want to cry." Zhixiu thought about it, then asked, "Where do you live?" Qi Jian was a bit nervous, asking, "What are you going to do?" Zhixiu said, "Didn't you say you made me a few new sets of clothes?" Qi Jian leaned against his back and softly snorted. "Who said I made clothes for you?" Zhixiu smiled, but said nothing. Qi Jian said in a low voice, "Southern wilderness, Zhan's star position." For Li Zhixiu stared blankly, then slowly closed his eyes. He ran in that direction with her on his back. It was a large grassland. Under the sunlight, it looked like a wheat field suffused with golden waves. It looked just like that grassland in the Garden of Zhou. After Chen Chongqing retreated, he did his utmost to keep quiet so as not to disturb them. But soon after, he realized that he was worrying too much, because Zhixiu and Qi Jian clearly only had eyes for each other and no one else. Or else how could Zhixiu, famed for his vigilance, not have heard the dense footsteps and voices of people? Qiushan Jun, Tang 36, and the others walked through the stone path and arrived at Chen Chongqing's side. Just as Qi Jian had said, there were many ways to pass through this stone path, and the disciples of the Mount Li Sword sect naturally had ways to calm the sword intents. When they arrived, they just happened to see Zhixiu clumsily spreading out his arms, wanting to embrace Qi Jian. Tang 36 laughed. "Is this guy trying to pretend to be Xin Yuanpe?" Qiushan Jun arched his brows. Go Hanshi shook his head. Guan Feibai's face was as cold as ice. Liang Banhu silently creased his brow. Bai Kai almost cursed. His little junior sister, who had grown up in the palm of his hand, was suddenly about to be embraced by another man. Anyone who saw this scene would be in a rather foul mood. Even if it was a gentle gentleman like Go Hanshi or someone as lofty and far-sighted as Qiushan Junzhixiu carried Qi Jian on his back as he ran down the valley. The faces of Guan Feibai and the others softened a little. Chen Chongqing walked over and said to Qiushan Jun, "Thank you." Qiushan Jun pointed down the valley and said, "If this is the case, then forget it." There was naturally sympathy and tenderness for his junior sister, especially for him, but to say that he truly wanted this pair of lovers to get married was also a lie. So he said forget it. But Chen Chongqing was not talking about this matter. "I heard that before Senior Suli left, he wanted to leave you a letter, but you did not accept it." Chen Chongqing said, "Just now, when I was crossing the stone path, I understood its meaning." Qiushan Jun said, "There was no deeper meaning to my actions. I just didn't like martial granduncle conduct that day and was rather annoyed, so I did not accept it." After a moment of silence, Chen Chongqing said, "Senior's conduct truly was rather irresponsible. I also didn't like it. Everyone says that I'm very similar to Senior Suli. Presumably, if I met him, I would definitely like him." Tang 36 regretfully said, "It's a pity that we didn't have the chance to meet, or else Senior would definitely have passed on some good things to me." Guan Feibai sneered, "Why don't you go look in a mirror?" Tang 36 arched his brows. "Every morning when I wake up, I look in the mirror. I'm very spirited and handsome. Could it be that your martial granduncle was born very ugly?" When it came to making jokes, not even all the disciples of the Mount Lee Sword sect added together would be a match for him. Go Hanshi indicated for Guan Feibai to say no more, then said to Chun Changsheng, "His Holiness the Pope used the sword to break the Tao. According to the rules, you can now be considered a member of my Mount Lee. If an ordinary cultivator of the world could be considered a disciple of the strongest Mount Lee Sword sect, they would naturally be more than happy to do so." But Chen Changsheng was no ordinary person, and his status was extremely noble. Not even the sect master of the Mount Lee Sword sect could compare. Go Hanshi's words had no other meaning. He was just informing Chen Changsheng. In his view, Chen Changsheng naturally would not accept it. This was truly the case. Chen Changsheng had no conflict with the Mount Lee Sword sect. In the past few years, the two sides have been deeply involved, and he and Go Hanshi and the other disciples of the younger generation were rather congenial. It was just that as the Pope, no matter what, he could not enter the Mount Lee Sword sect, or else what would the priests of the Li Palace do? Chen Changsheng said, "We've always walked the same path, so we're naturally of the same sect." Go Hanshi praised, "These words have true meaning." Just at this moment, Qi Jian's happy laughter came from the plains outside the valley. Seeing that extremely clear line of dust on the plains and those two figures in front of them, the crowd all sighed with emotion. Chen Changsheng and Xiushan Jun shook their heads and said in unison, "I also don't know just what that fellow is thinking." With these words, the entire crowd fell silent. Everyone knew that the fellow they were speaking of was Su Li, but the silence was not because of the disrespect in these words. Go Hanshi looked at Chun Changsheng and Xiushan Jun with a slightly surprised expression and said, "The two of you have quite a tacit understanding." The rest of the people were also looking at them. Chen Changsheng and Xiushan Jun glanced at each other, then very tacitly turned around and said no more. Chapter 9:33. On the same night, the Mount Lee Sword sect arranged a banquet in the valley, using a bonfire to roast meat. To someone of the Pope's status, this sort of reception was unavoidably rather disrespectful. Chen Changsheng had no objections. He knew that this was because Qi Jian was rather shy and unwilling to leave the valley to face too many of his fellow disciples. Moreover, roasting meat over a bonfire had its own wild charm, and he very much liked it. But when he thought back to the scene of him roasting meat and drinking wine in Sloping Cliff Horse Farm and realized that Xiushan Jun was not present, he felt rather complicated. Tang 36 was holding a bowl of wine and talking to Yi Xiaolian, making the girl tremble in amusement. Go Hanshi and Hu 32 were sitting together, whispering to each other. They were probably planning some important matters for the future. Guan Feibai by Kai and the others were sitting next to Chen Changsheng, motionlessly staring across from them. On the other side of the bonfire, Zheshio and Qi Jian sat together. Qi Jian was leaning against his shoulder, the smile on his small face seeming particularly happy in the light of the fire. Zheshio's new clothes were also very eye-catching. It could be seen that the craftsman had only been average, but the stitching was very dense, indicating that a great deal of thought and effort had been put into it. Chen Changsheng was very gratified by this sight. Guan Feibai and the others were naturally in a terrible mood and quickly left the valley, with Yi Xiaolian following them. In the dead of night, the bonfire hissed in the wind. Qi Jian was leaning against Zheshio's shoulder, softly humming a little tune. Chen Changsheng looked around, and with a thought, he brought Nank out of the garden of Zhou. Seeing Nank suddenly appear by the bonfire, Qi Jian was rather nervous and subconsciously gripped the hilt of the sword at her waist. "You should call her little aunt." "There's no need to be so nervous," Chen Changsheng said. Qi Jian froze for a moment before understanding the meaning of these words. She looked at Nank's face, her emotions rather complex. Tang 36's gaze moved back and forth between Nank and Qi Jian, ultimately resting on Chen Changsheng. "It feels like this seniority is a bit messy." Chen Changsheng ignored him and expressed his intentions to Qi Jian. For a period of time, Nank would also be living in Mount Lee. He hoped that Qi Jian could help take care of her. Qi Jian confirmed that this was a matter that the sect master had tacitly agreed to, so he naturally would not refuse. Leaving Nank in the Mount Li sword sect was Chun Chongqing's decision after careful consideration. The first was for Nank's safety. Wu Qiangbai's question from Holy Maiden Peak was still ringing in his ears, and if she left his side, only the Mount Li sword sect had the ability and was willing to take in this demon princess. In addition, the Mount Li sword sect's righteous sword Pure Heart would also be of some assistance to Nank's recovery. One was a cure, and two were also a cure. In any case, Zhixio wanted to stay in Mount Li to treat his illness, so he might as well have Nank treat him as well. As Chun Chongsheng and Qi Jian spoke, Nank stared blankly at him. She did not understand why he wanted to separate from her. Just like in the last few days, she grabbed his clothes, but this time, she would she. Looking at her eyes, Chun Chongsheng's mood was somewhat downcast, but he had no choice but to softly coax her for a long time before Nank finally let go. Qi Jian had been watching this entire time. Qi. Hearing this, Chun Chongsheng was stunned. Tang 36's laughter traveled to the depths of the grassland outside of the Green Valley and startled countless nightbirds. My dad definitely doesn't want to call you brother-in-law. Qi Jian glanced at Nank, sitting quietly at Chun Chongsheng's side, and said, Can you not be like this? Chun Chongsheng had always had a gentle personality, but he could no longer hold back his displeasure. Just what did I do? I didn't do anything. Qi Jian said, You understand what I'm saying. Zhixio said, What she means is, don't treat other girls too well. Tang 36 said, Do you think that Chun Chongsheng doesn't understand? He clearly understands, which is why he became angry out of humiliation. After taking care of matters at Mount Li, Chun Chongsheng and the others bid farewell on the morning of the next day and returned the way they had come. Even now, no one knew what problem had occurred in White Emperor City. A shadow had always been cast over his heart, and he was very worried. He and Su Yurong had agreed to meet in the small village at the base of Holy Maiden Peak. He was confident that the latest news would arrive at that time. When the time came, they would decide what to do next. The morning light had just fallen on the Green Mountain, and the wind over the Tong River was still somewhat chilly. Chun Chongsheng gazed at the small village across the river. He knew that Su Yurong had probably already arrived, and his mood improved slightly. At this moment, the cry of a goose came from the sky. A red goose transformed into a red line as it broke through the clouds in the north and landed in front of him. Hu 32 untied the letter tube tied to the red goose's leg and, according to the method agreed upon, removed the seal, took out a letter, and placed it in front of Chun Chongsheng. Chun Chongsheng's expression did not change as he read the densely packed words on the letter, but everyone could sense that he was rather nervous and angry. The grass on the banks of the Tong River was covered in a thin layer of frost, just like the emotions in his eyes. Chun Chongsheng took a piece of paper and scribbled a few words. He had Yi Xiaolian give it to Su Yurong on the other side of the river, saying, I have urgent matters to attend to, so I will leave first. After saying this, he no longer hesitated. He boarded the carriage that the Southern Taoist Church had prepared and rode along the official road on the western shore of the Tong River to the north. Yi Xiaolian had no idea what had happened, but when she crossed the river and saw Su Yurong, she couldn't help but feel a little uneasy as she handed over the letter. Su Yurong already knew what had happened, so she was not angry at Chun Chongsheng's sudden departure. However, when she saw the words on the letter, she couldn't help but feel a little displeased. If you want to go, then go. I won't say anything, but riding my crane to see some other girl is a little too much. Following the Tong River to the north and exiting the eastern foothills of the Luomei Mountains, Chun Chongsheng's party arrived at the southernmost county of the Great Zhou Dynasty, Renan County. By the time the carriage entered the prince of Renan's estate, the sun had just risen over the treetops. From this, one could see just how urgent the journey had been. Tang 36 and Hu 32 both felt exhausted to the extreme, but at the same time, curious to the extreme. Ever since Chun Chongsheng had left Sloping Cliff Horse Farm, someone had been sending him letters. All the arrangements of the Li Palace were related to these letters. So, just who was the one writing them? Why was Chun Chongsheng so obedient? And what was the content of this letter that made Chun Chongsheng so anxious? It even made them recall what had happened in Fengyang City when Chun Changsheng learned of the change in Holy Maiden Peak. To Chun Changsheng, just who in the world had the same status as Su Yurong. Upon reaching the depths of the Prince of Runan's estate, Tang 36 and Hu 32 found no answer. Moreover, the one waiting for them was not the Prince of Runan, but the Prince of Luyang. This most useless prince of the Chun clan seemed extremely exhausted, his body covered in dust. He had probably just arrived from the north. Upon seeing Chun Changsheng walk in, the Prince of Luyang hurriedly paid his respects, kneeling on the ground and raising his but high in the air. Chapter 9:34. Tang 36 felt a little strange at this sight. Even if Chun Changsheng was the Pope, even if this prince was more cowardly, why did he need to make such a grand bow? Chun Changsheng gazed at the Prince of Luoyang's clumsy movements and cumbersome body in a daze. For some reason, he did not immediately have the prince rise. Tang 36 once more felt that something was wrong. It was clear that there was something wrong with Chun Changsheng's attitude toward this prince. Amongst the princes of the Chun clan, the Prince of Luyang could be said to be the most inconspicuous and honest. No matter how fierce the conflict between the imperial court and the orthodoxy, he had always treated the Li Palace with the utmost respect. The scene from before had proved this point. Logically speaking, given Chun Changsheng's personality and conduct, even if he was not particularly intimate with this prince, he should not have been so cold. Not hearing Chun Changsheng's voice, the Prince of Luyang appeared extremely uneasy. Sweat poured down his face as he gave Tang 36 a pitiful glance. Tang 36 lightly poked Chun Changsheng's back with his finger. Chun Changsheng finally came to his senses and hurriedly had the Prince of Luyang rise. The Prince of Luyang gave a clear sigh of relief. He hurriedly took out a very thin letter from his bosom and carefully offered it to Chun Changsheng, as if it was a family heirloom. Hu 32 looked at the cover of the letter and confirmed that it was not the usual letter or the letter from this morning. So who had written this letter? The intricate decorations on the window seemed real, and the light coming in from outside was much dimmer, making it rather gloomy. Chun Changsheng looked at the seal on the letter, paused for a few moments, and then very skillfully opened it. The handwriting on the letter had not been seen for many years, but it was still familiar, just like the writer. The strokes were smooth and flowing, like a stream flowing outside the village. It seemed elegant and charming, but it was actually a hidden strength of character, like a solitary peak in the mist. Chun Changsheng's face darkened when he saw the first line. The contents of the letter he had received this morning were indeed true. He frowned and never loosened his frown. Tang 36 and Hu 32 looked at him, questioning him with their eyes. "This is a letter that teacher wrote to me," Chun Changsheng said. The two were shocked, speechless at this answer. The Prince of Luyang was constantly wiping away his cold sweat. The room was quiet, not a single sound coming from the Prince of Runan's estate. The imperial court and the Li Palace, the master-disciple relationship between Shang Xingzhou and Chun Changsheng, had been in a stalemate for several years. The situation was extremely tense. Suddenly, Shang Xingzhou sent him a personal letter. What was he trying to do? Of course, it was impossible that he had decided to bury the hatchet with a student just because he had drunk 2 pots of wine last night and wanted to take a look at the moon of the demons in the north. This could only mean that something very important had happened on the continent. This matter was even more important than the war between the orthodoxy and the imperial court. It was so important that even someone as cold and powerful as Shang Xingzhou had no choice but to temporarily put aside his issues with Chun Changsheng and even ask him for help. Shang Xingzhou's letter was very concise, and Chun Changsheng very quickly finished reading it. He thanked the Prince of Luyang for his hard work. The Prince of Luyang was very happy, but he didn't know what to do next, so he stood there in a daze. Tang 36 gave him a look. The Prince of Luyang reacted and hurriedly bowed as he withdrew. After he left, Tang 36 immediately asked what happened. Chun Changsheng said, "White Emperor City is going to hold the Heavenly Selection Ceremony." Tang 36 felt that the name Heavenly Selection Ceremony was rather familiar, but he had forgotten where he had seen it before, so he didn't know what it meant. Hu-32's expression suddenly changed as he harshly said, "Preposterous. Just what is the demi-human race thinking?" Only after Hu-32's explanation did Tang 36 understand the meaning of the heavenly selection ceremony, and his expression turned grave. Princess Hua's betrothed partner will be the next White Emperor. Correct. Tang 36 turned to Chun Chongsheng and asked, "Didn't you take care of her meridians? Why can't she inherit the position of the White Emperor?" Chun Chongsheng was quiet for a few moments, then replied, "There's naturally someone who doesn't want her to become the next White Emperor." Tang 36 understood who he was speaking of and asked in confusion, "Madame Mu is her mother. What benefit does this have for her?" Hu-32 was concerned with another question. "Who does Madame Mu intend to marry Princess Luoluo?" Chen Chongxing thought of the contents of the morning letter and said, "There are many rumors in White Emperor City. It seems that it should be the second prince of the Great Western Continent. The imperial clan of the Great Western Continent truly does not give up on their evil intentions." Hu-32 harshly said, "The blue-clothed visitor died just 2 days ago, and now they're using this sort of trick. Madame Mu has been married to the White Emperor for several centuries, and it's rumored that the two have always been in love. Who could have imagined that she would still wholeheartedly care about her paternal clan, even wanted to take away the benefits of her own daughter? In the past, I thought that only those uncivilized remote villages would have such foolish women, but I truly didn't expect." Tang 36 was filled with loathing. Hu-32 asked in confusion, "Will the White Emperor agree to her actions?" Chun Chongsheng replied, "His Majesty the White Emperor remains in seclusion. No one knows his stance." Tang 36 suddenly felt that something was wrong. The shadow of the imperial court and Shangxingzhou was clearly behind the schemes of the Great Western Continent. To put another way, this had always been an attempt by Shangxingzhou and Madame Mu to get rid of Qin Chongsheng. If Madame Mu wanted to use this marriage alliance to allow the Great Western Continent's imperial clan to successfully disembark, Shangxingzhou would be happy to see it happen. Why was he so fiercely opposing it? Shangxingzhou had naturally written a letter to Chun Chongsheng in the hope that he would ruin the grand ceremony of returning to the origin. Chun Chongsheng was naturally the best candidate to stop the marriage alliance between White Emperor City and the Great Western Continent, as he had a sufficiently revered status and a very special relationship with the demi-human race. In this matter, he could play an even greater role than Shangxingzhou. The problem was that Shangxingzhou was the de facto #1 person in the world, and Qin Chongsheng was the student that he most wanted to kill. The relationship between the two was abnormally complex, and he had assuredly spent a very long time in writing this letter to Qin Chongsheng. It had not been easy at all, and the more difficult it was, the more it showed just how intense his stance on the matter was. Why was his stance so intense that he was even willing to ask for help from his own student, even if he might have to make some concessions to his student afterwards? Black Robe is currently not in Shualao City, Chun Chongsheng added. Moreover, 20-some days ago, the Demon Palace held a ceremony to the stars. It caused an enormous stir, but I don't know what happened. Hu-32 understood, and his complexion paled. Tang 36's expression also turned abnormally grave. If Shangxingzhou's judgment was correct, the human race was about to face its most dangerous situation since the siege of Luoyang 1,000 years ago. Everyone was saying that Luoluo might be married off to the Great Western Continent's second prince. But what if she wasn't? What if White Emperor City's marriage partner was someone else? What if that person came from the north? Chapter 9:35. Tang 36 looked into Chun Chongsheng's eyes and very seriously asked, "You believe in your teacher?" Chun Chongsheng replied, "Master is exceptionally intelligent and has keen insight. Not even Black Robe can conceal all the secrets of the heavens, so I believe in his judgment." Tang 36 said, "You know that's not what I mean." Chun Chongsheng fell quiet for a while, then said, "To Master, killing me and subduing the orthodoxy are the most important matters, but exterminating the demons and having the human race unite the continent is his lifelong wish, his lifelong pursuit." In this aspect, I have absolute trust in him. In the history of the continent, the most important change was the alliance between the human race and the demi-human race. It was precisely because of this that Emperor Taizong was able to lead the allied armies of the two races on a successful northern expedition, driving the demons back to the snowy wastelands. In the following several centuries, the human race obtained enough time to rest and build up strength, making it so that the demons found it difficult to advance south. If the demi-human race suddenly broke their agreement with the human race and switched sides, what would happen? Shang Xingzhou and Chen Changsheng did not have a conflict of ideals, but a conflict of Taoists. Chen Changsheng was the only flaw in Shang Xingzhou's Tao, so Shang Xingzhou had to think of a way to erase his existence. But compared to this major event, this was nothing. Just as Shang Xingzhou had said in his letter, White Emperor City could not be lost. A rare solemn expression appeared on Tang 36's face. Then we must prevent this from happening. Fortunately, all this was just a guess, not yet true. The human race still had time to react. If not for Shang Xingzhou's extremely sharp perception of these problems and his extremely daring judgment, the situation would have become extremely terrible. When he thought of this, even though they were on different sides, Tang 36 still found it hard to suppress his admiration for this venerable Taoist. Chen Changsheng walked to the window and raised the stainless sword. He silently used the intellectual sword to calculate for a long time, but he still did not obtain a definite answer. The demi-human race, is it really possible for them to ally with the demons? In the history books, the conflict between the demi-human race and the demons was stained with blood and the tragic fate of the demi-human race. Logically speaking, the demon race would never forget those grudges, let alone ally with the demon race. Hu 32 said, In truth, this matter isn't completely impossible. Don't forget, 1,000 years ago, the relationship between the humans and demi-humans was also very bad. If the demons were willing to pay a sufficient price to quell the hatred of the demi-humans really might side with them. Tang 36 said, The problem is the motive. If Madame Mu is willing to take this risk for the sake of the great Western continent, would the demi-human lords, ministers, and generals agree? Hu 32's gaze fell on the letter in Chen Changsheng's hand. Perhaps this is the reason. Tang 36 also looked over, but he didn't understand. The demon race has been in decline for 1,000 years. Even if a new monarch ascends to the throne, it will be impossible for them to return to the terrifying strength of the past in a short period of time. But our human race has become more and more powerful in these 1,000 years. Just like what the blue-clothed visitor said on the summit, we have too many geniuses and experts. Hu 32 looked at Chen Changsheng and seriously said, My lady said before that the venerable Taoist wholeheartedly wants to carry on Emperor Taizong's dying wish and exterminate the demons to unite the world. When the time comes, what will the demi-humans do? Submit and pay tribute, or become slaves of the demons like in ancient times? Tang 36 said, The current White Emperor is the hegemon of his generation. Does he not even have this much confidence? Hu 32 was quiet for a while, then said, In these last few years, the entire continent has been talking about a phrase. Chen Changsheng was taken aback. What phrase? Hu 32 said, One temple of Xining rules the world. Chen Changsheng fell silent, as did Tang 36. The meaning of this phrase was crystal clear. It referred to the story of the past 10-some years, as well as the current period of history. So if one looked into the distance, what would one see? If Shang Xingzhou and Chen Changsheng reconciled, and together with the emperor, who on the continent would be a match for the human race? Even the White Emperor would feel an intense apprehension and unease when he looked at this master and disciple trio from Xining Village's temple. It might have been fine if this was an impossible matter, but many people believe that the problem between Shang Xingzhou and Chen Changsheng should never have existed. An important figure like the White Emperor might even believe that the standoff between Shang Xingzhou and Chen Changsheng was a hoax created by this master and disciple. Chen Changsheng did not respond to Hu 36's gaze. His gaze fell on the letter. At the end of the letter, Shang Xingzhou had written 4 words: "Wait and see." If one wanted to watch, one had to be present. He said, "Let's first take care of this matter." Hu 32 replied, "Of course, but I don't know when White Emperor City will hold the heavenly selection ceremony. Since the Li Palace is acting, the Orthodoxy's diplomatic mission should be formed as quickly as possible." Chun Changshang said, "The time for the heavenly selection ceremony has probably not been set, but White Emperor City's thoughts are very clear. Even if they can't hide this matter forever, they won't want us to suddenly interfere, so they won't give us time to make arrangements. Thus, I will go first, and the diplomatic mission will follow soon after." Hu 32 said, "Understood." Tang 36 said, "I'll first return to Wenshui." A large portion of the demi-human business was handled by the Tang clan, and Wenshui City had always had a good relationship with White Emperor City. This matter involved the future of the human race, so the Tang Old Master naturally could not stay out of it. He would probably make some corresponding arrangements. Chun Changxing nodded. "Then I'll go first." At this moment, the clear cry of a crane came from the prince's estate. The winter winds howled, and the trees in the courtyard swayed as a white crane descended. The Prince of Luoyang was kneeling in the distant porch, respectfully sending Chun Changxing off. Tang 36 finally couldn't help but ask, "Why did the venerable Taoist have His Highness deliver this letter?" Chun Changxing replied, "His Highness spent last night in Mount Shao, so he was closest to this place." Tang 36 thought to himself, "This is clearly illogical. If the imperial court wanted to send a letter, whether it was by Red Eagle, Red Goose, or a ray, they could all reach the Prince of Runnan's estate. There was no need for the Prince of Luoyang to make this trip." Chun Changxing knew that he could not persuade him, so after a moment of silence, he said, "Master knows that I trust him more." Tang 36 was even more confused, thinking, "Why do you trust this prince fame for being a good-for-nothing?" Chun Changsheng explained no more and mounted the crane. One man and one crane flew up into the clouds. The Tong River had become an indistinguishable strip, and the Luome Mountains were like a bonsai to the left behind. Clouds and mist could be faintly seen in the extreme west, the Green Mountains in the distance. Who knew what awaited him? The Green Mountains and the sea of clouds looked like the fog on the other side of the lake, but also like the smoke rising from the kitchen chimneys in the streets of the capital in the middle of winter. Luo Luo sat on the edge of the mountain, gazing at the clouds below, her petite figure seeming rather delicate. If one could see her face, they would probably get the same feeling, because although her picturesque face was filled with reminiscence, it was still calm. Guardian Li looked at her, a look of pity in her eyes. In her view, Her Highness had been very lonely in the last few years, and was only getting lonelier. Chapter 9:36. Luo Luo asked, "Did Imperial Mother leave the palace again today?" Guardian Li whispered, "It seems like she went to the other shore for some business." Luo Luo added, "Did little aunt return a few days ago?" Guardian Li replied, "She should have." Luo Luo asked, "Was the matter at South Stream Temple true?" Guardian Li was somewhat hesitant, but she still answered yes. Luo Luo was quiet for a while, then said, "Then they wanted to harm teacher." Guardian Li did not dare to respond to these words, especially when she sensed the emotion in her voice. "I didn't think that the legend of New Northbridge was true. Teacher had always been acquainted with that black dragon." Luo Luo gazed at the green mountain on the other shore, faintly discernible in the clouds. "But where is she being imprisoned by Mother?" Guardian Li whispered, "There's no way to find out." Luo Luo sighed and said, "Am I very useless?" Guardian Li didn't know how to respond. Although Her Highness was the most revered person in White Emperor City, how could she possibly influence the Empress's actions? Luolua's spirit was suddenly roused, a happy expression appearing on her elegant face. But it doesn't matter. Teacher once said that the most important thing in life is not whether we are useful or not, but whether we can live smoothly, whether we can live happily. In the same sea of clouds, on the edge of another cliff, there was also a petite figure, but she did not give off the impression that she was weak. Perhaps because she had never suffered since childhood and had received a different education, Mu Jiosher's beautiful face was always filled with confidence. She seemed especially bright and radiant, exuding an aura of nobility. Madame Mu could naturally tell that her younger sister was in an extremely low mood, but she was only pretending not to care. She walked to the edge of the cliff and embraced Mu Jiosher, tenderly saying, "As a daughter of the Mu clan, it truly is very difficult." Hearing these words and feeling the warmth of her sister's body, Mu Jiosher could no longer pretend. She leaned over and said in a wronged and sorrowful voice, "I also don't know when that fellow started following us. Elder sister, am I too useless?" She was naturally speaking of Qiushan Jun. Madame Mu replied, "Imperial Uncle's plan was wrong from the start. So how can you be blamed?" Mu Jiosher raised her face and asked in confusion, "Wrong?" Madame Mu continued, "Even without Qiushan Jun, everyone on the plateau believed that Zhusha killed Bi Tianxin. So what? Imperial Uncle wanted to use the name of Cinnabar to burn this fire onto Chun Changsheng, but he did not think that the Pope of the human race was not so easy to kill." Mu Jiosher had not gone to South Stream Temple, but she was well aware of what had happened on the plateau. Her eyes widened as she asked, "But at that time, Qin Changsheng really did almost die?" Madame Mu shook her head. From the very start, Shang Xingzhou was using Imperial Uncle and had no intention of personally entering the fray. Didn't they see that the Prince of Xiang had done nothing from start to finish, quietly watching from the sidelines like a guest? Only an idiot like White Tiger would make a move before the situation is clear. Surprised, Mu Jiosher asked, "The Prince of Xiang did not act because he was intimidated by Wang Pe?" Madame Mu replied, "You've already crossed that threshold. Every action of yours has its own deep meaning. How can it be shaken by external forces?" Mu Jiosher thought, then didn't that mean that Imperial Uncle had died in vain? With hatred in her voice, she said, "The people of Zhou truly are cunning and sinister." Madame Mu replied, "The matters of 1,000 autumns can never be rushed. Imperial Uncle's venerable self is only taking such a dangerous move because his lifespan is reaching its end, to see if he can obtain some good fortune. As for you and I, there's no need to be in such a rush. Once we've taken care of the matters here, we can make arrangements." Mu Jiosher thought of the grand undertaking her big sister had spoken of and couldn't help but feel somewhat agitated. "I'm just worried that elder sister will be alone and without help." Madame Mu smiled. "I'm not a loner like Tianhai." Mu Jiosher was still worried. "But this matter is truly too grand. There's a blood feud between the demi-humans and demons. How will you convince those elders and ministers?" Madame Mu replied, "In the past, this matter would naturally have been difficult to handle, but now is the best time. Shang Xingzhou's ambitions are far too clear. Everyone knows that he wants to unify the world, and everyone knows that he has the ability to do so. Coupled with the fact that Chun Changsheng is such a genius and has such a great reputation, and that emperor is also an extraordinary individual. If this master and disciple of his sect work together, let alone the demons, would your brother-in-law and those elders and ministers not be worried?" Mu Jiosher replied, "The venerable Taoist is naturally frightening, and Chun Changsheng isn't bad either. But that emperor resides deep in the palace, so it's truly impossible to see what's so extraordinary about him." Madame Mu replied, "Those who are skilled in battle have no illustrious reputation, and the ability of a shepherd only depends on the growth of his flock. Ever since that emperor began to govern, the imperial court has been clean and tidy, not sparing any worthy person. The affairs of government have been smooth, and the people have lived and worked in peace. He's even more extraordinary than his mother. Emperor Taizong was nothing more than this." Mu Jiosher pensively said, "So that's how it is." She then thought of another matter and worriedly asked, "Then what about Bi Tianxin and Bi Yanghong?" "In a few days, as long as they recover from their injuries, they'll definitely come for revenge." Madame Mu replied, "No, you're wrong." Mu Jiosher did not explain. Could it be that they fear Big Sister's majesty and the demi-human experts and don't dare to come? Madame Mu gazed into the depths of the sea of clouds and indifferently said, "When I say that you're wrong, I'm not saying that they won't come, but that they've already come." As she spoke, a peal of thunder exploded in the sky. Boom! The sea of clouds in front of the mountain surged with countless waves that spread in all directions, but they did not split apart. In the gloomy and damp forest below the sea of clouds, countless monsters ran for their lives. Deep in the turbid waters of the Red River, some massive aquatic monsters growled and then lowered their heads. The sea of clouds in the sky was pulled toward the edge of the continent, the center growing thinner and thinner until a hole appeared. A beam of light spilled down from the hole in the clouds, accompanied by two figures. It was an extremely beautiful and mystical sight. Seeing these two figures land on a nearby green mountain to the west, Mu Jioshi's expression suddenly changed. Madame Mu was calm and silent, her thoughts inscrutable. Chapter 9:37. Breaking through the clouds was Byong Hong and Wu Qiongbai. The dust over the 80,000 li had been blown away by the strong winds in the sky, but it could not disperse the solemnity and gravity in their eyes. After leaving Holy Maiden Peak, they had taken a little time to rest, not waiting for their injuries to completely recover before rushing to White Emperor City. Even though they were experts of the divine domain, they had paid no small price. Their faces were rather pale, and they seemed very tired. Standing on the green mountain, Byong Hong surveyed his surroundings. His eyes were slightly profound, allowing him to clearly see everything that was going on within several dozen li. On the other shore, White Emperor City was rather noisy. The demi-humans had probably sensed their arrival and were in a hurry to mobilize their armies and experts. Byong Hong raised his right hand and unfurled his fingers. Several deep blue ice crystals imbued with boundless cold floated out of his palm. They were blown about by the mountain winds, but they did not follow the wind. These ice crystals seemed to weigh nothing as they floated to some place behind the mountain. Byong Hong and Wu Qiongbai followed behind. It didn't take long before they saw a tree more than 1,000 zhang tall rising into the sky. The top of the tree broke through the clouds, its whereabouts unknown. The tree was extremely thick, looking like a wall. There was a hole at the base of a tree, and a house had been built in the hole. A black-clothed girl sat on a stone bench in the room, her chin propped up in her hand, seeming rather worried. As if they had seen their loved ones, the blue ice crystals turned into streaks of light and flew toward the black-clothed girl. The girl sensed them and raised her head. Those deep blue ice crystals burrowed into the red birthmark between her eyebrows and vanished. The girl looked at Byong Hong and Wu Qiongbai, wariness appearing on her cold and beautiful face. She was a proud and powerful dragon, but she could clearly sense that these two human experts had the ability to harm her. Byong Hong's gaze moved down to the girl's feet. As he looked at the chains, he slightly creased his brow. Wu Qiongbay's complexion turned extremely nasty as she gazed at the black-clothed girl. In her view, even if Tianxin's death had nothing to do with this girl, he had still died to her dragon breath. She prepared to step forward and vent her anger, but Byong Hong's stern gaze stopped her. "Lady Zhu Sha, I will think of a way to save you," Byong Hong said to the girl. This girl was naturally the legend at the bottom of New North Bridge, the current Pope Chun Changsheng's protector. She had many names. Chun Changsheng liked to call her Zhizhi, but Byong Hong, an expert of the continent of his generation, still used the name Wang Zhizi had given her, Zhu Sha. When he saw the chains at the girl's feet, Byong Hong confirmed that his son's death had nothing to do with her, as she could not leave this mountain. Since this was the case, he would naturally think to save her. Thus, he naturally had to think of a way to save her. It was truly because Byong Hong's little red flower was far too famous, and Wu Qiongbay's horsetail whisk and her face were equally unsightly. This matter was also extremely famous. She had already been trapped on this cliff for some time and had vaguely guessed at something. 2 days ago, she had even sensed the death of an expert of the divine domain, but she still did not know the specifics, much less why these two experts of the continent had suddenly appeared here. She pondered Byong Hong's words and said, "Then I'll have to thank you, but it seems rather difficult." Byong Hong's gaze continued down the cliff from her ankle, his expression a little strange. The iron chain seemed to be tied to a stone hole on the ground, but with his keen eyesight, he could tell that the stone hole was actually the top of a stone embryo, and that the stone embryo was at the bottom of the cliff. In other words, the iron chain was connected to the entire mountain. If he wanted to take the little black dragon away, he would have to shatter this cliff and the extremely hard stone embryo within it, or he would have to sever the connection between the chains and the stone embryo. The former was not feasible, although he should be able to do it if he used the full extent of his cultivation. That kind of movement would be too big. Moreover, it would consume a lot of Star Radiant's true essence, which would greatly affect the actual battle later. As for the latter, there was clearly something wrong with the aura of the iron chain and the stone embryo, as if there was an invisible lock. Byung-hong's expression slightly froze. Tiger War, Gigi replied. I don't know what it's called, but it's a pretty good name. Byung-hong knew that it was definitely correct. The object that bound the chains to the stone embryo was assuredly the legendary forbidden artifact of the demi-humans, the Tiger Roar. This was a forbidden artifact used by the White Emperor clan to punish traitors. The White Emperor clan was born with divine strength, but they were absolutely incapable of breaking free of the Tiger Roar. It was most suitable for imprisoning the little black dragon. Even an expert of Byung-hong's level would find it extremely difficult to break free of the Tiger Roar. But since it was a forbidden artifact, it assuredly had a key, and the key was naturally in Madame Mu's hands. Once I kill her, I'll release you, Byung-hong said. Gigi replied. Then I truly must thank you. Byung-hong suddenly sensed something and turned to look at the sea of clouds. A wind blew over from the sea of clouds, causing the sea of clouds to ripple and tremble. Many cracks appeared in the clouds. As he gazed at the meadow emerging from one of the cracks and the two women standing on the meadow, Byung-hong felt like the salty and wet air of the wind had suddenly become countless times heavier. Seeing Madame Mu's somewhat similar appearance to Mu Jioshu's, Byung-hong fell silent for a moment, then clasped his hands in greeting. Madame Mu calmly returned the greeting. Wu Qianbai naturally would not bow to her, nor did she speak. She only stared at Mu Jioshu, her eyes so venomous that they seemed like poisonous flames burning deep underground. No matter how extraordinary Mu Jioshu's background and proud and arrogant she was, being stared at by an expert of the divine domain like this, and thinking about Bi Tianxin's matter made her feel very guilty. She instantly felt her body and mind turn cold. Somewhat afraid, she moved to hide behind Madame Mu. Byung-hong looked at Madame Mu and asked, Empress intends to protect her? Madame Mu replied, This is White Emperor's city, and she is my younger sister. Do you think that I would let you touch her? Wu Qianbai pointed at White Emperor's city across the sea of clouds and shouted, Do you think that you can rely on those idiots of the demi-humans to stop us husband and wife? Her voice was abnormally shrill, like two swords incessantly grinding against each other. In contrast, Byung-hong's voice was still warm and gentle, but even more resolute. His Majesty the White Emperor is in seclusion. You are alone. Madame Mu calmly replied. So the two of you disregarded worsening your injuries and rushed over as quickly as possible. Byung-hong replied, Yes, I wanted to ensure that no one was faster than us. Madame Mu's expression did not change. Do you think that as long as the great Western continent cannot send reinforcements in time, I will be forced into a situation where I have to fight one against two? Byung-hong replied, Correct, this is not a fair contest, but a father and mother's vengeance. Madame Mu faintly smiled. Then did you ever think that although my husband is in seclusion, he is not cut off from the world? If I really do die, do you think that he will not act? And even if the two of you work together, are you sure that you can defeat me? Mother is in the hospital again. In the next few days, it will probably be just like it was in the last half year. If I have time, I will write. If I don't, I will tell and report to everyone. Chapter 9:38. As she said this, her expression was very calm and indifferent, yet it also seemed incomparably confident and powerful. She was the princess of the great Western continent, the empress of the demi-human race. She had become a saint many years ago. Tian Hai had died at the peak of the mausoleum of books. Yin had returned to the sea of stars, and the holy maiden of the south had followed Su Li to the sacred light continent. Of the 5 saints, only she and the White Emperor remained. There is no question that she and the White Emperor could be considered some of the strongest experts of the present age. Even if the White Emperor were in seclusion and she alone fought Biyang Hong and Wu Qiongbai, she was not certain to lose. And this was not even considering the fact that this was the shore of the Red River. There were still countless demi-human experts in White Emperor City. With a single order from her, they would surge forward like a tide. "Empress, you misunderstand," Biyang Hong said. "We husband and wife have never had the extravagant hope of killing you today. We only want to take Mu Jiushi away and ask her a few questions." Mu Jiushi's small face paled at these words, not daring to respond. Madame Mu smiled. "You want to take my younger sister away and ask her a few questions about young Master B's last words. And then what?" Wu Qiongbai finally could not restrain her emotions and harshly said, "If she cannot give an explanation, this old woman will naturally tear her to pieces." Madame Mu's smile faded as she looked at Biyang Hong and asked, "Do you think I will agree?" Biyang Hong replied, "You should be well aware that I have the ability to delay you for a while, enough time for my lowly wife to finish what she wants to do." Madame Mu calmly stared at him for a very long time, then suddenly laughed. Her laughter echoed between the cliffs and the sea of clouds. There was no joy in it, only toughness and indifference. "I believe that Sir B has also misunderstood." Madame Mu's smile faded as she looked at him and said, "I have never thought about protecting little Sure." Biyang Hong's gaze froze as he asked, "What does Empress mean?" "Everyone says that I was expelled from the great Western continent by Imperial Uncle. Over the past several centuries, countless people have felt injustice for me, like Tian Hai and Eldarine. But in truth, none of them knew that I left of my own volition, and all my abilities were actually taught by Imperial Uncle. To me, Imperial Uncle was both teacher and father, the person I respected the most." Madame Mu expressionlessly said, "You killed him, so I naturally had to avenge him and kill all of you. Other than that, I did not consider any other possibility." Biyang Hong fell silent. With his and Wu Qiongbai's strength, it was very difficult for them to directly kill Madame Mu, perhaps even detain her, but the reverse was also true. Unless the other party had helpers. The question was, who would help her? With the blue-clothed visitor dead, the great Western continent scheme had been exposed. He and Wu Qiongbai, as the storms of the human race, had come to avenge their son. Not even Shang Xingzhou would appear in this sort of situation. Moreover, they had come so quickly that White Emperor City probably had no time to lay down any traps. The sea breeze came from outside the sky and never stopped. The 2 layers of clouds in the sky and outside the cliff kept twisting and twisting, but did not disperse. The hole in the clouds that Biyang Hong and Wu Qiongbai had torn open was gradually covered up. The light was retracted, leaving the cliff gloomy. There was a tree on the edge of the cliff. Compared to the massive tree on the cliff where the little black dragon was imprisoned, this tree seemed particularly tiny. The tree has a shadow. In such a dim environment, the reflection of the tree should have been extremely faint, but it gradually grew thicker. The little red flower on his pinky seemed to have sensed something. It whistled through the air and pointed at the distant tree, appearing especially vigilant. Biyang Hong looked at Madame Mu and said, "The Empress's ambition and daring are truly frightening. Imperial Uncle insists on killing Chen Changsheng and inciting internal strife in the Zhou dynasty. But I know that this is no easy task and that there is a high chance of failure." Madame Mu calmly said, "This being the case, I will naturally prepare a few backup plans." Biyang Hong sighed. He had made countless preparations and used the will of the heavens to calculate for many hours, but he had not expected that he would still fail. He said to Wu Qiongbai, "In a little while, if I can find a chance to cut open a path, you can leave. I will follow." Wu Qiongbai couldn't help but be alarmed at these words, thinking just what has happened. No matter how strong Madame Mu is, if we work together, we can still fight. Is there a need to be so pessimistic, declaring defeat before the battle has even begun? If this really was the case, Why had they broken through the clouds and come to White Emperor City? Wu Qianbai had a ruthless and coarse personality, but she was still an expert of the divine domain. With just a thought, she understood what had happened and turned to the tree at the edge of the cliff. The shadow cast by the tree grew thicker and thicker, gradually turning the color of ink, becoming a black cloth. The wind from the western sea rustled the leaves of the tree, rustling the shadow on the ground, like a corner of a robe being lifted. It was a real corner of a robe. This robe was black. It trembled in the wind. A person appeared beneath the tree, his entire body shrouded in a black robe. Wu Qianbai's face was somewhat pale. Bi Yanghong's expression was abnormally solemn, unprecedentedly solemn. He knew that the two of them were facing the most dangerous situation in their lives, because they were about to face the most terrifying opponent besides the Tianhai Divine Empress. The cliff was deathly still. There was no sound, not even the sound of the wind. The black robe swayed in the wind, giving off an abnormally sinister feeling. Seeing this legendary demon military advisor, even Mu Jiushi felt a deep fear and hid far away. Bi Yanghong looked at Madame Mu and said, "You're actually colluding with the demons. Does the White Emperor know? Do the demi-human elders know?" Madame Mu calmly replied, "You are the first person to see it with your own eyes." Bi Yanghong asked, "Have you ever thought, if this matter were to be known, how would you continue to be empress?" Madame Mu replied, "There's no need for you to worry about White Emperor's city." Bi Yanghong asked, "Or are you saying that you're confident that no one else will know of this matter?" It was already very difficult for him and Wu Qianbai to kill, or even defeat, Madame Mu. Similarly, it was also very difficult for her to kill the two of them. Even if Madame Mu was a saint, even if the helper she had invited today could be said to be the most mysterious and terrifying demon military advisor on the continent, it was not so easy to kill an expert of the divine domain. On the plateau of South Stream Temple, the blue-clothed visitor had died because the situation had abruptly reversed. He had gone from the person who had set the trap to the person involved, and his preparations had been severely lacking. But even in these circumstances, Bi Yanghong and Wang had paid an extremely heavy price in order to kill this person. Madame Mu was truly powerful, and Black Robe was naturally terrifying, but Bi Yanghong had comprehended more after the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, his cultivation level rising once more. He was confident that he could hold off his opponent for a few moments. He only needed a few moments, or the slightest gap, to send a warning to the outside world. The possibility that the demi-humans were colluding with the demons was assuredly a major event that would alarm the entire world. No matter how tense the standoff between the Great Zhou imperial court and the orthodoxy, no matter how intense their struggle, there would only be one attitude towards this matter: resolute suppression. All the experts would rush over, whether it was the heads of the noble clans, the sectmaster of the Mountly Sword sect, or Wang Pe. Even the venerable Taoist Shang Xingzhou might personally act. Chapter 9:39. Madame Mu clearly understood what Bi Yanghong wanted to express and said, "You have no chance." Bi Yanghong said no more. With a shake of his right arm, his sleeve flew through the air. Countless waves of qi rumbled like thunder as they assailed Madame Mu. It was very difficult to notice that, in contrast to his actions, a small arrow made of jade silently flew into the sky above the Red River. If this jade arrow were allowed to break through the clouds and flee in the wind, it would have to inform the human experts in the capital and the south 80,000 li away. A strand of his soul had been attached to the jade arrow, so there was no need for words. It had its own message. However, the moment the jade arrow released its radiance in the sky suddenly darkened, as if night had arrived. Black Robe waved his sleeve under the tree, transforming it into the darkness. Not only did it block the path of the jade arrow, it also obscured the surrounding secrets of the heavens. Wu Qianbai gave a shrill howl, her horsetail whisk transforming into countless streams that enveloped the plateau. The qi of silent extinction followed, transforming into a vast lotus sea. In the depths of the lotus sea, a lotus flower sprouted, swaying in the wind and drifting in the water. It seemed slow, but it was actually moving with incredible speed toward the horizon. Madame Mu's expression was indifferent. Her two sleeves flew up, stirring up the winds in the sky. This wind came from the western sea, its dampness tinged with a chill. It was like a real blade, slicing the thick sea of clouds into countless pieces. Countless white clouds descended like a flock of sheep, descending upon the damp and barbaric forest. The chi of the world instantly became countless times more sluggish, seeming extremely viscous. Wu Qiongbai grunted as she sensed that the lotus flower formed from true essence had suddenly slowed. Although it had not been destroyed, it could no longer leave. Bi Yanghong's expression was as calm as ever, unaffected. The jade arrow was not Bi Yanghong's true move, nor was it his strongest move. He had used the jade arrow to draw Black Robe's attention while Wu Qiongbai had used the lotus sea to draw Madame Mu's attention, and then they had attacked. A cultivator's hand could grip a sword, a pestle, or a palm, but the simplest form was to clench a fist. Bi Yanghong's fist punched at Black Robe. In the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, after seeing the Tianhai Divine Empress's fist, Bi Yanghong's most powerful technique had become his fist. There was still a distance of several thousand feet between him and Black Robe, but a dark passage suddenly appeared between them. The nameless tree on the edge of the cliff began to shake violently. A fist condensed from starlight passed through the passage at an unimaginable speed. With a power that seemed to be able to split mountains and split seas, it smashed toward Black Robe's face. Before it reached his body, Black Robe's clothes began to whistle. The Black Robe was slightly disheveled. Under the sunlight, one could faintly see the Black Robe's pale green chin, as well as two cold, star-like eyes. Black Robe's eyes shone with admiration and caution as he gazed at Bi Yanghong's fist. Regardless of whether he was the demon military advisor or another identity, he had seen many true legendary-level powerhouses. He was also a legendary-level powerhouse. Bi Yanghong's fist still made him feel threatened, so he knew that he had to treat it very seriously. A gloomy, lusterless iron plate appeared in front of him. A loud bang resounded. Bi Yanghong's fist slammed against the iron plate. This iron plate had already been heavily injured, and now that it received the full-force blow of an expert of the divine domain, it cracked and deformed. Black Robe's body swayed twice. Then he took 2 steps back. With a hum, the small tree behind him shattered into countless fragments and was then blown away by the wind, vanishing without a trace. Around 30 li behind him, on a cliff on the opposite shore of the Red River, several dozen extremely deep cracks suddenly appeared. Countless rocks rustled and tumbled down. The cliff had been split in two, and with a heavy grinding sound, it fell into the river, stirring up terrifying waves. The true power of the full-force attack of an expert of the divine domain truly could cut mountains and block rivers. Bi Yanghong's wariness only intensified. The continent had always had many theories about the mysterious demon military advisor Black Robe. As a human expert, he was even more so. Everyone knew that Black Robe was assuredly a legendary-level expert, but no one knew just how strong he was. Whether it was in the era of Emperor Taizong and Wang Jitze or now, no one besides Su Li had ever exchanged blows with Black Robe. Moreover, Su Li had primarily been trying to break out of the encirclement, so it was impossible to accurately judge Black Robe's strength from the outcome of that battle. Until today, when Bi Yanghong punched at him. Bi Yanghong was not a proud person, but he was well aware of his fighting prowess amongst human experts, and he had used 90% of his strength in this punch. Yet Black Robe had so easily received it. The iron plate was probably a divine artifact, but even so, Black Robe's strength was still rather unfathomable. But it didn't matter, because even this punch was not Bi Yanghong's strongest move, nor was it his true move. He was keenly aware that the important point of today's battle was not whether he and his wife could defeat their opponent, but whether he could notify the human experts. Thus, whether it was the Jade Arrow, the Lotus Sea, or this punch, they were all cover-ups. The moment he punched out, The string on his pinky finger had already silently snapped. The little red flower was already in the sky. Neither Black Robe nor Madame Moo could stop its departure. The little red flower flew away with unimaginable speed, drawing out a thin red line in the blue sky. A white cloud still quietly floated in the sky. If someone had been paying attention to this white cloud from the very beginning, they would realize that whether it was Byung Hong and Wu Qiong by breaking through the clouds, or Black Robe, revealing his true body, or the howling winds from the Western Sea, none of them had caused the white cloud to change its shape. It had not even trembled. This white cloud was extremely thick and should have been somewhat darker, but in the clear blue sky around it, it was still pure white, as if it was not real. The little red flower flew into the white cloud and then vanished. It did not fly out of the white cloud and vanish into the blue sky or into the distance. It simply vanished. Byung Hong had not noticed the white cloud at the start, but now he suddenly sensed something and raised his head. The plateau was quiet. Neither he nor Wu Qiongbai, nor Madame Moo, nor Black Robe attacked. The white cloud slowly began to flow, and then it gradually split open. A crack appeared in the middle of the white cloud. From the ground, it looked like an eye. This eye was looking down on all life on the continent. A ray of light shot out from this crack. This ray of light was golden, imbued with an unimaginable aura of light, seeming extremely divine. But this ray of light was also extremely somber, as if it could crush all things, destroy all things. Byung Hong vaguely guessed at the answer and was utterly shocked. He muttered, "Are you not afraid of the end of the world?" Chapter 940. Byung Hong's words were naturally directed at Madame Moo in Black Robe. Madame Moo stood with her hands held behind her, her expression extremely solemn and serene. She did not answer the question. The tree by the cliff had already been obliterated by the fist and tent, but the shadow of the tree still remained where Black Robe stood. The mottled shadow of the tree fell on his body, obscuring his expression, but it could not drown out his voice. A strange laughter overflowed from Black Robe and then rumbled like a thunderclap into the surroundings, deafening to the ears. Byung Hong's expression gradually returned to normal, but his heart had already sunk. Today, he had come to avenge his son's death, but it now seemed that he would also die here. With a clang, he waved his sleeve. An illusory sword condensed from pure star radiance rose from the ground, cutting through the sky tens of thousands of zhong as it slashed at the white cloud. It was like a real scraping sound, like a heavy mountain sliding across the ground. The white cloud swayed for a few moments, and the little red flower within it saw its chance. It transformed into a red stream of light and returned to the plateau. It quietly floated above Byung Hong's head, seeming extremely vigilant. The white cloud scattered, the golden light filling the entire sky, dazzling and bright. If not for the seal Black Robe had laid down beforehand, this light would have alarmed the entire continent. Right now, only a few people on the two shores of the Red River could see this light. But because it was too bright, they simply could not see the true scene. Byung Hong and Wu Qiongbai could see that their expressions had become abnormally grave. In Wu Qiongbai's eyes, one could even see confusion and fear towards the unknown. Two figures gradually appeared in the boundless light. White wings several dozen zhong long slowly flapped behind them. These two people were completely naked, the curves of their bodies perfect and clean. There was nothing extraneous about them, and it was impossible to determine their gender. Countless rays of light exuded from their bodies and wings, seeming divine and brimming with the will to destroy. Just what were these two people? Where did they come from? The angels of the sacred light have already arrived. Do you still want to resist? Black Robe's voice was abnormally cold, but compared to the last 1,000 years, it was tinged with an indescribable emotion. It seemed like the appearance of these two existences he called angels of the sacred light had also somewhat affected his mind. Byung Hong was truly flabbergasted that the legend had become reality and appeared before his eyes. However, he was one of the strongest experts on this continent after all, so he quickly regained his composure. especially when his gaze pierced through the light and swept across the bodies of the two angels. His expression became indifferent. With just these two androgynous monsters, he did not know if those two so-called angels in the sky had understood his words. The battle began in the next moment. Two streams of light ignored the distance of several thousand zhang between the blue sky and the plateau, seemingly passing through space to arrive in front of Bi-Yang and Wu Qiongbai. What followed was infinite light, a terrifying pressure, and a sacred yet destructive attack. In the dazzling light, for the first time, Bi-Yang and Wu Qiongbai clearly saw the faces of these two angels up close, though only for an instant. The appearances of those two angels were extremely perfect. Their expressions were absolutely indifferent, devoid of any human emotions. They were filled with a sense of holiness. There was an arc-shaped light scar between their eyebrows. It was extremely beautiful and incomparably holy. From the perspective of a human, these two angels looked very similar, only their chi distinguishing them. One was extremely callous, the other ruthless, but they were also not human emotions. They were more like inanimate objects, like furious waves or frigid frost. A sword glow tore through the waves of light and slashed at the callous angel, but it was caught between the two wings. Bi-Yang sensed a power as majestic as the starry sky. The illusory sword condensed from star radiance was instantly shattered into countless fragments. The little red flower shrieked, its petals blooming, blocking the fragments and the waves of light. A loud bang resounded. Countless cracks appeared on the plateau, stones madly flying, and a hole several zhang deep appeared. Bi-Yang stood at the bottom of the hole, his hands raised. The angel indifferently floated in the air, one of its hands pressing down. The situation on the other side was even more perilous. As she watched the angel descend from the sky, Wu Qiongbai recalled the legend she had read as a child in the 10,000 Years Pavilion. Her heart trembled in fear and unease, her Tao heart finding it hard to guard. The lotus sea swayed in the absence of wind, a gap appearing in her defenses. The angel transformed into a stream of light and slashed down like a sword. With a light swish, Wu Qiongbai left arm was cut off, flying into the sky in a dazzling spray of golden blood. Hearing his wife scream, Bi-Yang bellowed and punched out with both fists, imbued with the star radiance and true essence he had bitterly cultivated for centuries. He pushed back the angel and rushed to Wu Qiongbai. With a wave of his right hand, he once more condensed a sword of star radiance and forced back the angel. The little red flower flew back, rapidly circling around Bi-Yang and Wu Qiongbai like a shooting star, exuding a powerful chi that temporarily stabilized the situation. In a single exchange, Bi-Yang knew that these two angels from the sacred light continent were extremely terrifying. These two angels seemed to instinctively understand and freely use the laws of the world. If placed in the cultivation system of this continent, they would be innately experts of the divine domain. Moreover, their bodies seemed to be formed from the purest sacred light energy, incomparably tough and indestructible. Even the demon imperial clan would find it very difficult to compare to them. Most frightening of all was their unimaginable speed and reflexes. They were like real rays of light, able to defy the laws and principles of the world to advance and retreat. In the face of such powerful and inexperienced opponents, even Bi-Yang, who was ranked near the top of the divine domain, found it extremely difficult to deal with them. As for Wu Qiongbai, she cannot even take a single blow. If not for Bi-Yang godly reaction speed, she would have already lost her life. Wu Qiongbai knew that the situation was extremely dangerous, so even though her severed arm was in extreme pain and the divine energy within was still wreaking havoc, preventing her from using star radiance to repair her body, she clenched her teeth and made no sound. Her face was as pale as snow, and the fear in her eyes could not be dispelled. Bi-Yang gazed at his wife's wretched state, his eyes chilling with rage. The two angels floated in the air, expressionlessly watching Wu Qiongbai and Bi-Yang on the plateau. The callous angel's gaze fell on Wu Qiongbai's severed arm, looked at the golden blood dripping from it, and suddenly opened his mouth to speak. As he spoke, his expression was indifferent, but his voice was dignified to the extreme. He was probably using the language of the sacred light continent, his tone extremely strange and complex. Logically speaking, no one on the plateau should have been able to understand his words. But strangely, his words, blown by the chilly winds of the mountains, became the language of the continent. As expected of thieves of fire, you have profaned God and must die. Chapter 9:41. Byung-hong understood these words, but he did not quite understand their meaning. He did not know what fire stealers were or what god these foreign experts worshipped. He knew that he was facing the most dangerous situation of his life, even more dangerous than when he faced the Tian-Hai Divine Empress in the Mausoleum of Books. That his foe could make the chilly winds of the mountains transform his voice into the language of the continent proved that his conjecture was correct. These monsters from the sacred light continent truly did have an innate ability to understand and use the laws of the world. It was even possible that their existence was based on these laws. But Byung-hong was now extremely calm, even his expression indifferent. As an expert of the continent, when encountering a truly major event, he naturally could not panic, needed to maintain his composure. After the previous clash, he had a grasp of the way these two angels fought and the way they used the laws of the world. In a one-on-one battle, he was confident that he would not lose. The problem was that his wife had lost an arm and was heavily injured, while Madame Mu and Black Robe, two truly unfathomable experts, were still at the side. The ruthless angel suddenly descended, the sword of light in his hand, slashing at Byung-hong. Although he had only been awake for a short period of time, his will to fight was still intact. He sensed that this human expert could threaten him. Thus, he decided to first eliminate this person. Byung-hong swung his sleeve and attacked with extreme elegance, the hand gripping the illusory Sword of Star Radiance noiselessly bursting out of his sleeve. A fist appeared in the air and smashed the angel's Sword of Light into pieces. At the same time, the rapidly spinning red flower suddenly left Byung-hong's side and attacked the face of the other angel. The little red flower suddenly shattered into countless, extremely sharp petals. With a dense howl, light exploded, and it suddenly faded. When it once more illuminated the surroundings, it was already 10-some li away in the sky. Several tiny wounds appeared on the faces of the two angels, golden blood brimming with divine energy dripping down like dew. They looked at Byung-hong hovering in the air, but their eyes were still devoid of emotion, anger, wariness, only indifference. The more it was like this, the more terrifying it was. Countless peals of thunder exploded in the sky, waves of chi gushing out and cruelly tearing the last white cloud to shreds. After a while, countless streams of light fell from the sky and finally turned into visible lines of fire. It looked like a meteor shower. The people of White Emperor City cried out in alarm, and chaos ensued. Some of the more cowardly people even thought that it was heavenly punishment and knelt on the ground, kowtowing. Some of the large tribes and the manors of the wealthy immediately activated their arrays, preparing to withstand the infinitely high temperature of the lava. The beast guards of the palace, the army of White Emperor City, and the large number of experts under the control of the Council of Elders were already prepared to quickly extinguish the flames. But the situation was not as frightening as imagined. Those streams of fire vanished before they could reach the ground, leaving only the remnants of heavenly fire that caused the temperature of White Emperor City to soar. It was like a blistering summer day had arrived, and only a few streams of light fell into the Red River. All of the sky above White Emperor City had been sealed off by restrictive spells, so that no sound or light could escape. The experts of the continent, who could understand those streams of light, could not see them, and the demi-human populace and ministers, who could see those streams of light, did not know what they were. Blood fell from the sky. Each streak of light was a drop of blood. This blood came from the experts of the distant continent, and it also came from the experts of this continent. They were all supreme existences of the divine domain, and their blood contained boundless divine energy. It was as pure and holy as gold, and even hotter than magma. When a few drops of divine blood fell into the Red River, those huge monsters silently sank deeper into the water. Many of the less intelligent monsters could not resist their instinctive desires at all. They swam over with all their might, and then fought fiercely over the blood, fighting over it to devour it. The monsters that devoured the last few drops of divine blood were immediately devoured by even more savage monsters. This process was cruel and boring, repeated many times. Only late in the night did the ownership of these drops of divine blood finally be determined, seized by a fire flood dragon that had come from the depths of the celestial tree. This fire flood dragon was not one of the lucky ones. With a fighting strength comparable to a star condensation expert, it was simply incapable of enduring the divine energy contained in these drops of divine blood. In the turbulent and treacherous waters, the fire flood dragon struggled for an entire night, ultimately combusting and dying. On that night, the Red River was so bright that it seemed to be burning. On that night, many demi-human commoners noticed the strangeness of the Red River. They kneeled on the banks and prayed, praying for the White Emperor to come out of seclusion as soon as possible, praying for God to bestow his grace, praying for the 9 celestial trees hidden in the clouds to block all calamities for the demi-human race. Although those streaks of light did not land on the ground and did not bring with them the terrifying heavenly fire, White Emperor City was still in chaos. The waves of chi from the sky had damaged many buildings, and the fences of the beast gardens and pastures near the celestial tree had been completely overturned. Countless beasts had taken advantage of the chaos to escape. In order to maintain order and stabilize the situation as quickly as possible, White Emperor City was officially under martial law. Other than the commoners kneeling on the banks of the river, the majority of the city was quiet and soldiers patrolled the streets. Places near the Imperial Palace and forbidden areas like Whitestone Mountain were even personally guarded by the elite Red River Beast Guard. The outer city along the river was somewhat more relaxed, and it was much more deserted than usual. No one dared to go out, and even if they did, they would kneel to the blazing Red River. No one was in the mood to get drunk. The small tavern's business was extremely poor, and it had long since closed. Xin Yuan left the small tavern and went to the shore. As he gazed at the light and flames rising from the depths of the river, he sensed the divine qi contained within. He subconsciously glanced up at the sky, thinking just what happened during the day. Was it a battle between experts of the divine domain? From Star Caesar Academy to the Orthodox Academy, from the capital to White Emperor City, the Bear Youth had always been extremely diligent in his cultivation. In the eyes of others, his arm had long since been crippled, but he still maintained an extremely strong self-confidence, just like those other fellows in the Orthodox Academy. However, he was keenly aware that with his current cultivation level, he was still extremely far from the divine domain. No matter how long he looked, he would not be able to discover anything from those divine flames in the river. As a result, he quickly left the riverbank and walked back to his home. His home was also in the outer city along the river, in a place called the Pine Paths. Many of the poor people of White Emperor City lived here, and the majority of the buildings were constructed from the most common and cheapest pine wood, barely enough to keep out the cold. However, the flow of water was often not smooth, and as he walked through it, he would occasionally smell a foul stench. Xian Yuan seemed unaware of this as he silently walked along the slope. Whether it was the cursing coming from the houses on the side of the street, the galloping of heavy cavalry in the distance, or those flying carriages flying through the night sky that looked extremely like streaks of fire, none of them caused his expression to change. Chapter 942. He turned right at a small alley called 3 Harmonies Lee, walked to the end of the alley, and pushed open a rather old-fashioned wooden door. This was the small courtyard that he had lived in for several years. This courtyard was very small, only a zhang or so in circumference, but it was extremely clean. The ground was paved with white stones, and a pine tree not even taller than a man was planted among the white stones. It was especially beautiful against the gray walls and black eaves. The small courtyard was surrounded by the temple of the celestial tree of the pine paths. It was very quiet, and besides the two tolls of the bell, there was no other noise. It could be said that this small courtyard was the best building in the pine paths, though not many people knew of it. Xin Yuan walked over the white stones and sat down on the wooden floor in front of the door. He took off his shoes and put on a pair of clean white socks. Before entering, he glanced at the pile of firewood by the door. The pile of firewood was not very high, but it was very neat. If one looked carefully, they would even realize that the length and thickness of each firewood were almost exactly the same. Xin Yuan thought for a while, then he slowly pulled out a metal rod from the pile. This metal rod had no edges, much less any edge. It looked very ordinary and unremarkable. In truth, it was a sword. No matter how the tier of legendary weapons was ranked, this sword would assuredly be ranked in the top 10. Who could have imagined that the legendary mountain sea sword was currently in a small courtyard in the slums of White Emperor City, and that its owner had casually stuck it in a pile of firewood? It had received a similar treatment in the Orthodox Academy, even having to endure the smoke of the kitchen and even be responsible for prodding the charcoal fire in the stove. Xin Yuan hefted the metal sword and pushed open the door. The area of the room was also very small, with a low table and several prayer mats. In the middle was a paper door separating the living quarters. Xin Yuan gazed at the paper door, his left hand gripping the metal sword slightly tightening. His breathing remained calm, but his expression became extremely solemn. The paper door was very thin, let alone the mountain sea sword. Even his stalwart and muscular body would be blown over by a single breath. Just what was he on guard against? Or even a faint fear? Suddenly, a voice came from the paper door. "I don't know who you are, but since you were able to sense our presence the moment you entered the small courtyard, you must also be a cultivator. Please come in and have a chat." Xin Yuan showed no surprise. He looked at the paper door and asked, "Who are you?" On the other side of the paper door, the room was slightly dark. Occasionally, the light from the flying chariot would pass through the tall window and illuminate the room for a moment. There was some blood on the wall, and there was a faint golden color in it, but there were no longer any aura fluctuations. A Taoist nun was leaning against the wall. Her appearance was delicate and pretty, and it was impossible to tell her age. Her brows were filled with hostility, but her eyes were filled with fear. A scholar sat beside her. His face was slightly pale, but his expression was calm, as usual. It was Byong Hong and Wu Qiongbai. If not for the fact that Madame Mu was maintaining the seal over White Emperor City and Black Robe was shielding them from the heavens, they would have found it very difficult to escape alive. Even so, they had still suffered severe injuries at the hands of those two angels, paying an enormous price. Wu Qiongbai was alarmed and infuriated by Byong Hong's words. "Why didn't you quickly kill him and let him in? Since you're the owner of this place, how can you be rejected by the guests?" Byong Hong looked at the figure on the paper door and calmly said, "We cannot move, cannot come out to welcome you. Please enter." Xin Yuan fell quiet for a while, then raised his sword and pushed open the paper door. The first thing he saw was a pile of crystals on the ground, 2 small pagodas, and several pieces of spirit wood. It was obvious that this was some sort of array that could ensure that none of the qi within the array leaked out and could not be discovered. Then he raised his head to look at the 2 people leaning against the wall. It was not that the brats of the Orthodox Academy had naturally become more careful as they grew older, but because so many things had happened in White Emperor City today. The Red River Beast Guard was still searching everywhere, and the flying carriage was still flying through the night sky. So he had no choice but to be more cautious. Xin Yuan stared blankly at the pale and wary Taoist nun. When he saw the severed arm on her shoulder and the blood covering her body, he couldn't help but be dazed. Is this the cycle of the heavenly Tao? On a certain night, this Taoist nun came to the capital and tortured a stray dog to death. Guanbai stopped her, so she cut off one of Guanbai's arms. Soon after, this Taoist nun came to the Orthodox Academy, broke through the wall, and wanted to kill him just to vent her emotions. If not for Su Li's letter, he would have died that night, and the Orthodox Academy would have been destroyed. In his eyes at the time, this Taoist nun was a true demon, powerful and callous. Who could have expected that when they met again after so many years, this Taoist nun would be heavily injured, her arm severed? Xian Yuan said nothing, only turned to the man dressed in scholar's robes. There were no wounds on this person's body, not even dust, and his expression was very calm. But Xian Yuan sensed an aura of death. It was obvious that this person had suffered even more serious injuries in an even deeper part of his body. When he thought of this, Xian Yuan suddenly felt sorrowful. Since the Taoist nun was Wu Qiongbai, this person was naturally Biyanghong. Just who in the world could injure Biyanghong and Wu Qiongbai like this? When they were chatting in the Orthodox Academy, Tang 36 had once discussed this question with them. Only that saint couple could defeat this divine domain couple, the White Emperor and the Empress. The problem was that the White Emperor was in seclusion. So who was the Empress's helper? As Xian Yuan thought of these things, Biyanghong's gaze fell on the metal sword in his hand. The Mountain Sea sword had slumbered in the garden of Zhou's sword pool for many years and then remained in the Orthodox Academy, never appearing. Not even he had seen its true body. But he could sense that the energy contained within this sword was extremely extraordinary. Then, what of the person who possessed this sword? This person was assuredly a demi-human expert. Biyanghong mentally sighed, thinking this is fate. There's nothing to be done. But Xian Yuan did nothing. He did nothing, nor did he send any warnings. After a moment of silence, he asked, "What sort of medicine do you need?" Biyanghong froze at these words. Wu Qiongbai hatefully said, "What do you want to do? Don't even think about harming us." It was obvious that she had already recognized Xian Yuan. When she and Biyanghong had left the plateau, they were already heavily injured. Let alone fighting, they couldn't even stand. The seal on the two shores of the Red River had been activated, and it was impossible to conceal their tracks. They had risked entering White Emperor City to take advantage of the chaos, to find a chance of survival. At the time, White Emperor City was truly in chaos, but soon after, many demi-human experts began to appear, clearly in pursuit of them. They hid in all directions, eventually arriving at the less guarded outer city along the river. Walking into the pine paths, they sensed a spiritual intent in one of the alleys. Following it, they found a small courtyard and snuck into it. But before they could discover where the spiritual intent was, their injuries erupted and they hurriedly laid down in array. Xian Yuan returned. Chapter 943. Wu Qiongbai had never imagined that she would meet this person in White Emperor City. Although Xian Yuan had left the capital for several years, she believed that this person would never forget the grudge from back then, just like her. Thus, his words and his seemingly innocent actions assuredly hid an extremely sinister motive, just like her usual conduct. Xian Yuan said nothing. Wu Qiongbai spoke these words with a deep hatred. She seemed to be clenching her teeth, but her eyes were filled with fear. It was clear that she was very afraid that Xian Yuan would kill her or notify the demi-human experts of White Emperor City. Xian Yuan felt no joy at this sight. He only felt some loathing and pity. He said to Biyanghong, "The Deer Tribe's medicine storehouse is not far away. I know the steward, so I should be able to get some medicine." Biyanghong replied, "If that's the case, then I'll have to trouble little brother." Wu Qiongbai harshly retorted, "I don't believe you." Xian Yuan ignored her, taking the medicine list Biyanghong had written and leaving the room. Wu Qiongba's expression flickered at the sound of the door closing. Nervously and angrily, she yelled at Biyanghong, "This bear cub has an old grudge with me. If you let him leave, he will assuredly notify the demi-human court. You don't even know him, so why would you rather believe him than me?" Biyanghong calmly replied, "Although I don't know this person, I know that he is a student of the Orthodox Academy." Wu Qiongbai froze at these words, but she said nothing more. Her right hand hanging by her side trembled, indicating that she was not in a calm state of mind. After some time, Xian Yuan returned to the small courtyard in 3 Harmonies Li. In his hand was a heavy bag that seemed to be packed with many things. Byung-hong sincerely expressed his thanks. Xin Yuan-po shook his head, opened the bag, and took out the medicine. Suddenly, there was the sound of rushing wind in the quiet room. A horsetail whisk trailed behind it as it attacked Xin Yuan-po's face. Xin Yuan-po had not expected it and was too late to respond. Fortunately, the mountain sea sword promptly flew through the air and crossed over his head, blocking the horsetail whisk. With a clap, the small courtyard swayed, and the dust in the cracks in the floorboards was jolted into the air. If it weren't for the spiritual wood true tower formation on the ground, the commotion would have been even greater. Xin Yuan-po knelt on the ground on one knee, holding the iron sword horizontally in front of him. He felt as if a mountain was pressing down on him. It was extremely strenuous, and his breathing became much heavier. He raised his head to look at Wu Qiangbai's eyes that seemed to want to devour him. Furious and confused, he yelled, "Have you gone mad?" Wu Qianbai harshly retorted, "Back then, I wanted to kill you, and tonight, I even less want to accept your favor, or else it would be a humiliation. So you must die, and only a dead person will not reveal the secret." He had grown up in the mountains of a remote tribe, and when he went to the capital, he studied and lived in the simplest of places like Star Caesar Academy and the Orthodox Academy. Xin Yuan-po simply couldn't understand Wu Qiangbai's logic and angrily said, "Woman, how could you be so vicious, malicious, or crazy?" Wu Qianbai was still an expert of the divine domain. Even though she had lost an arm and was heavily injured, she was still countless times stronger than Xin Yuan-po. The iron sword gradually sank, and Xin Yuan-po looked as if he would not be able to hold on any longer. All of a sudden, a tinge of color appeared in the quiet room. This tinge was bright red, moist, and incomparably fresh. It was that little red flower. Wu Qiangbai's face was filled with shock and fear as she stared at the little red flower. She quickly drew back her horsetail whisk and placed it in front of her. With a few light pops, Byung-hong's finger descended like the wind, sealing off 2 of Wu Qiangbai's meridians. Wu Qiangbei was furious. She mobilized her true essence to forcefully break through the seal and counterattack. Byung-hong drew back his finger and watched the approaching horsetail whisk. He did not move. Wu Qiangbai's expression froze, her movements a little sluggish. Byung-hong vomited a mouthful of true blood, his face instantly paling. The little red flower flew back to his side and quietly floated there. Drops of dew began to appear on its heavily damaged petals, as if it was weeping. After leaving the plateau, the bit of true essence that Byung-hong had gathered after several hours had completely dissipated with this mouthful of true blood. Wu Qianbai saw this and finally understood. With a cry, she threw herself at him, embraced him, and began to weep. "You're crazy, just for a bear cub like this." Xin Yuan-po had a very perplexed expression. He did not understand what was going on. He had clearly wanted to save Byung-hong out of goodwill. So why did Wu Qianbai want to kill him? And why did Byung-hong want to protect him? Why did Wu Qianbai want Byung-hong dead in her rage? And why did she want nothing more than to die in his place when she saw Byung-hong vomit blood and in such pain? Were this couple of experts of the continent crazy? Xin Yuan-po fell quiet for a while, then said, "There are many people that want to capture the 2 of you. In the next 2 days, a major event will occur in White Emperor City, and many more experts will arrive. The 2 of you should stay here and not go out. I have some matters to take care of in the next 2 days. When the time comes, we'll see how to deal with them." After saying this, he put away the mountain sea sword, placed the medicine and the food and water he had bought on the ground, and got up to leave. When he reached the paper door, he stopped and suddenly asked, "Teacher, how could a person like you marry a woman like this?" Byung-hong did not answer this question. The wooden door to the courtyard closed once more, and silence returned. The only sound was the soft rustling of the short pine tree in the night wind. The room was quiet for a very long time, until the mood became increasingly oppressive and awkward. Wu Qianbai looked at Byung-hong and said in a trembling voice, "Senior brother, have you always regretted marrying me all these years?" Byung-hong faintly smiled at her. "Just what nonsense are you thinking? I presume that this is not the first time you've heard what that bear cub said. The more Wu Qianbai thought about it, the more embarrassed and angry she became. Do you think I don't know? In front of the mausoleum of books on Holy Maiden Peak, whether it was that demon empress of Tianhai or Wang Pe, wasn't this the same look in their eyes when they looked at me? The entire world thinks that I'm not worthy of you. Biang Hong sighed. Why do we need to care about what other people think of the matter between us? Wu Qianbai yelled. Aren't you the same? You think that I often embarrass you in front of the world. Biang Hong calmly gazed at her and said, Junior sister, I've never regretted marrying you, only regretted spoiling you too much. When he said this, his expression was very sincere. Wu Qianbai froze. It was hard to say if she really understood the meaning of these words. She only knew that she wanted to say something, but she realized that she didn't know what to say. She felt deeply wronged and began to weep bitterly, thinking, why was my luck so bad that I just had to meet this person? Chapter 944. The demi-human experts and the elite Red River Beast Guard had received the Empress's decree and were searching for the whereabouts of Biang Hong and his wife. Coupled with the phenomena from yesterday, the atmosphere in White Emperor City was abnormally tense. All the gates of the surrounding small cities leading to the mountains and wilderness had already been closed. It was difficult for the clouds and mists in the mountains to disperse. Only when the sun was at its brightest, or when the mountain winds were at their strongest, could one clearly see the 9 massive trees that reached into the clouds. But now, even more gazes were cast in the direction of the mountains. On the other side of the mountains was the Western Sea, and in the depths of the Western Sea was the rumored Great Western Continent. The latest rumor was that the second prince of the Great Western Continent was coming to White Emperor City to marry Princess Luohong. Today, the rumor was confirmed. The gates of the small cities leading to the mountains were all opened, the official roads trembled, and the monsters took shelter. The Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission was about to arrive at White Emperor City, and its representative was the second prince. The diplomatic mission was using the excuse of celebrating the White Emperor's birthday. Coupled with the relationship between the Great Western Continent and the Empress, the demi-humans had no reason to refuse. When the diplomatic mission finally entered White Emperor City, the tense atmosphere that had persisted for an entire day and night slightly relaxed. Many people from the demi-human tribes surged onto the streets to watch the spectacle, similarly watching the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission, but with incomparable wariness, naturally came from the humans. White Emperor City had 3 important buildings of the human race. They were the Great Zhou Imperial Court's diplomatic mission, the Orthodoxy's Taoist Church of the Western Wastes, and the Tang clan's trading company that represented the powers of the South. The first reaction of the Imperial Court's envoy and the Tang clan's steward upon learning of this matter was that if White Emperor City really did want to form a marriage alliance with the Great Western Continent, they had assuredly made all the necessary preparations. Other than informing the Imperial Court and Wen Shui of this news as quickly as possible, there was nothing else they could do. The bishops of the Taoist Church of the Western Wastes, which represented the will of the Orthodoxy, also understood that this matter was difficult to disrupt. But now that the entire continent knew that the Great Western Continent's imperial clan intended to harm the Pope, they had sent people to gather the Pope's students. How could they tolerate this? At the same time that the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission entered the palace, the Orthodoxy's Taoist Church of the Western Wastes also sent an extremely unyielding letter of protest that was comparable to a letter of challenge. At the same time, the invitation to a banquet for the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission was torn to shreds by the Archbishop of the Taoist Church of the Western Wastes in front of several thousand demi-human believers and then stomped on the shreds, leaving no face for the demi-humans. After confirming this news, the Great Zhou Embassy and the Tang family firm also declined the invitation to the banquet, but in comparison, they behaved more gently. Regardless of the attitude of the human race, the banquet was held as usual. That night, White Emperor City was decorated with lanterns and streamers, especially the Imperial Palace at the highest point. It could be said that it was brightly lit, and the place was bustling with activity. Even after the banquet ended, the liveliness did not subside. This was because the main guests, the members of the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission, had gone to rest, but many of the guests had not left. The hundreds of Red River Beast guards responsible for the safety of the palace were very vigilant and even somewhat nervous as they looked at the figures that remained in the palace. However, they did not dare to chase them away, and they did not even dare to persuade them. This was because these guests were all important figures of the Yao race, and some were even their fathers. Some of the important figures of the demi-human race in the palace were generals, ministers, and the majority were members of the Council of Elders. The Council of Elders of the demi-human race was somewhat similar to the Council of Elders of the demon race, but it was stronger and had a higher status. The demi-human race was composed of more than 300 tribes, and the 27 tribes with the longest histories and the strongest factions were naturally members of the Council of Elders. There were also 10-some seats that were elected by the remaining tribes. As for the ranking of the Council of Elders, it was very simple. Whoever had lived the longest and was stronger would be ranked first. At present, the chief elder of the demi-human race was the leader of the Xiong clan. It was rumored that this chief elder possessed divine strength. Although he had not yet stepped into the divine, he already had the ability to fight against experts of the divine domain. The chief elder's mountainous body was striking in front of the palace, but he was also as silent as a mountain. His silence did not quell the chatter in the palace. On the contrary, it seemed to become a sort of connivance. The chatter grew louder and louder, the mood growing more and more tense. These discussions were naturally related to the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission, to yesterday's phenomena, and also to the rumors of the last few days. Was Princess Luoluo really going to be married? Was there need to be so anxious? Had His Majesty still not recovered from his injuries? The question was, why couldn't it be Princess Luoluo? Although such a thing had truly never happened in the history of the demi-human race, wasn't it said that the Pope had already resolved her problem? A single rumor would give rise to many other speculations. Both the members of the Council of Elders and the demi-human generals were speculating on the veracity of the rumor and many other problems. Of course, whether Princess Luoluo was married or who she was married to had little to do with them, because the emperor of the demi-human race would always be a member of the White Emperor clan. The only ones who had the right were a few side branches of the White Emperor clan, but for fear of angering His Majesty and the Empress, they were even more subdued and silent, not daring to express any opinion. But did she have to be married to the second prince of the Great Western Continent? Madame Mu slowly walked into the palace hall, which seemed rather spacious because of its size. The demi-human elders, generals, and ministers all bowed in unison. The voice of the great elder of the demon race, who was as tall as a mountain, was incomparably deep and resounding, like an echo from deep within the mountains. But the words he spoke were extremely direct, incomparably in keeping with the demi-human race's personality and habit of discussing matters. Empress, do you truly intend to marry Her Highness off to the nephew of your paternal clan? The chief elder looked at Madame Mu, his right hand gripping the hilt of his axe, making no attempt to conceal his actions. If we do that, we will rebel. Madame Mu looked extremely petite in front of him, like a little person, but her aura was even more powerful. She indifferently said to the chief elder, "Then all of you can rebel." It was an incomparably indifferent sentence, but it was the most overbearing declaration. She had already been empress for several centuries and was deeply in love with the White Emperor. She was no longer that young girl who had just entered the land of the demi-humans. Her prestige in the demi-human race was extremely high. Whether it was the tribal leaders or the young hunters on the two shores of the Red River, they all regarded her as a god, not daring to show the slightest disrespect. At these words, the palace hall fell silent. No one dared to speak, only the night breeze lightly brushing against the sturdy stone walls. Even the chief elder felt a powerful pressure. After a moment of silence, he said, "We need an explanation." Madame Mu expressionlessly said, "Rumors are just rumors. Moreover, even if she is to be married, why is Elder rebelling?" The chief elder's expression did not change as he indifferently said, Empress, Empress, you should know the reason. Chapter 945. Madame Mu's gaze swept over the mountainous bodies of the demi-human generals. I understand what all of you are thinking. Luo Heng is my own daughter. If she could inherit the throne, would His Majesty and I still be so worried? In the end, rumors are just rumors. Whether from a few days ago or a few years ago, no matter how brimming with talent His Holiness the Pope is, he was still just a teenager. Do all of you really think that he can resolve a problem that has eluded my race for tens of thousands of years? It's just a trick that the human race has played. These words were extremely reasonable and persuasive. The elders, generals, and ministers in the hall thought about how Princess Luluo was still as petite and weak as she was when she was a child, not even having completed the fourth transformation of the divine body. She truly was completely different from His Majesty. Presumably, the problem of her meridians truly had not been resolved, and they couldn't help but sigh in regret. The chief elder was not convinced. I want to see His Majesty. Madame Mu stared into his eyes and said, You know that His Majesty is currently recuperating. The chief elder replied, I know, but the succession of the demi-human race is an important matter. His Majesty should be able to understand my intrusion. Madame Mu fell quiet for a while, then said, If His Majesty is willing to see you, he naturally can. 2 hours later, the chief elder returned to the palace hall. The flames of the oil candles stuck in the stone walls flickered despite the lack of wind. Countless pairs of eyes fell on the great elder, wanting to know if he had seen His Majesty by day and what His Majesty had said. The chief elder shook his head and said, I did not see His Majesty. The demi-human elders, ministers, and generals in the hall sighed in regret. But I sensed His Majesty's will, so I will no longer oppose this matter. The chief elder turned to Madame Mu and said, But this matter must be carried out according to the tens of thousands of years of tradition of my demi-human race. Even if Her Highness wishes to marry, it cannot be arranged in private. The wildfire of the celestial tree must choose its master, obeying the will of the ancestral spirits and gods. These words once more caused the hall to buzz with discussion, but this had always been a part of the rumor, so it was not too shocking. Madame Mu asked, Your meaning is to formally hold the heavenly selection ceremony? Correct. The chief elder's hand once more rested on his axe. Otherwise, we will still rebel. Madame Mu stared into his eyes and said, Everything will be done according to the rules of the clan. There can be no mistake. Do you dare to agree? The great elder said, Your Highness, you are deeply respected by the people of the clan. It has been several hundred years since then, and I am old. I only hope that everything will be the same as before. After saying this, he walked out of the hall, his mountain-like body casting a large shadow on the floor. The majority of the demi-human elders and about half of the ministers and generals bowed to Madame Mu and followed the chief elder out. Madame Mu was quiet for a while. Then she waved her sleeve, indicating that the ministers loyal to her in the hall should leave. Silence returned to the main hall. There was no one else besides her. The flame of the oil candle gave off a bright light, but there was a faint burnt smell. Moreover, when the night wind blew, the light became uneven. Several centuries had passed, but she still had not gotten used to it. She still somewhat missed the gentle light emitted by the merfolk pearls in the great western continent's imperial palace. The stone wall was illuminated very clearly. It looked extremely smooth, but under her gaze, she could naturally see the undulations on it. How could such coarse stone be qualified to enter the imperial palace? When she was a princess of the great western continent, she would never have imagined such a thing. Yes, she had been in White Emperor City for many years, but there were still many things that she could not get used to. Like the things mentioned earlier, like what had just happened. In the great western continent or the capital of the human race, a person with the chief elder's attitude would have been executed long ago. But this was White Emperor City. For tens of thousands of years, the demi-humans living here had lived like this. Discussions were direct, or perhaps barbaric. They were truly a pack of uncivilized beasts. She could not get used to it, nor could she truly change all this, because she was only the empress, not the White Emperor. She stood in the center of the empty palace hall in silence for a very long time. A wind blew in from the distant western sea, howling into the mountains. Many of the fish in the blue lake behind the mountains had died. A faint smile appeared on her face, incomparably affectionate, like a mother looking at her child. She had always been the mother of all demi-humans. With a flicker of light, a young man walked in. This young man was very handsome, tall, and elegant. He was the second prince of the great western continent. Madame Mu tenderly said, "You've made this trip for nothing. It's truly been hard on you." The second prince smiled. "For cousin's happiness, what does a little rain and wind count for? Besides, it's been many years since I've seen the scenery of the two shores of the Red River. I rather miss it." Madame Mu added, "Once the heavenly selection begins, entering the celestial tree to comprehend the wildfire will also be of great help to your cultivation. It's rare for me to come, so I naturally have to seek some benefits. But just who is the excellent husband that lady has chosen for cousin?" The second prince curiously asked. "Lady is so sure that he will be chosen by the ancestral spirits?" Madame Mu replied, "I only care about having him enter the celestial tree to be baptized by the wildfire. As for whether he will be chosen by the ancestral spirits, that will depend on his own ability." The second prince thought this over, then asked, "Is it Xiaoda?" Madame Mu patted his arm. "Don't think too much. Spend some more time chatting with your aunt. She's not in a good mood lately." The second prince sneered. "If I didn't know that Chen Changxing wouldn't come, I would definitely have exchanged blows with him." The day the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission arrived at White Emperor City. It was also the day after Biyang Hong and Wu Qiong had arrived at White Emperor City. It was also the day after the internal strife of South Stream Temple. It was also the day before the heavenly selection ceremony began. At that time, Chen Changxing was still at Mount Li and had not yet received the letter from Hongyan from the capital, nor had he received the letter personally written by his master, Shang Xingzhou, from the Prince of Luoyang. Neither the imperial court nor the orthodoxy had received any news from White Emperor City. Shang Xingzhou, who understood the secrets of the heavens, also had his gaze temporarily paused on Shuilao City in the north. No one knew that many days ago, a person had departed from Shuilao City and then entered White Emperor City on the same day as the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission. This young man had smoothly passed the inspection of the beast guards and taken up residence in a courtyard in the eastern part of the city. This courtyard had existed for many years. It was very ordinary, but it was very wide. The ground was covered in yellow sand, making it seem like a desert. A few bloodstains, suffused with a luster, seemed to have been mixed in with bits of gold, but they had long since lost their scent. Deep within the yellow sand was a tree. This tree was not very large, and its leaves were not very lush, but the area it cast on the ground was very large. There were no spots of light, and it was so gloomy that it seemed like the true darkness of night. The young man was standing under the tree. Although the shadows were very thick, one could still clearly see that there was no demon horn on his head. It was no wonder that he had been able to enter the city so easily. "This is the final foothold of my divine race in White Emperor City? Bloody yellow sand. Rather interesting." The young man held his hands behind him as he looked around with interest, but it was hard to tell who he was talking to. If the White Emperor really isn't asleep, then it's too dangerous. "Quickly leave, military advisor." "Yes, your majesty." The wind slowly rustled the leaves, causing the shadows to sway uneasily. It was like clothes, but also like someone was speaking. In the courtyard covered in yellow sand, the only person left was the young man, his hands held behind him. He raised his head to the sky. The winter sun shone on his face. His face was rather pale, and he did not seem very healthy. He narrowed his eyes, hands held behind his back, looking at the sky, narrowing his eyes. It seemed like all the important figures of the world liked this sort of action. Yes, this young man from Shuilao City was a truly important figure. He was the young demon lord that Chen Changsheng had met in the snowy mountains. Chapter 946. The young demon lord stepped on the yellow sand, following the seemingly old golden bloodstains as he walked towards a certain place. This was the back gate of the courtyard. The iron lock was covered in rust, as if it had not been opened for many years. It seemed very ordinary. If there was anything special about it, it was probably the two stone statues on the side of the stone steps. These two statues were probably of two men. They were completely naked, their bodies extremely perfect, and they had a pair of wings on their backs. The stone statues had no expression, but they gave off a lifelike aura, as if they could come to life at any moment. If those elders of the demi-human race who had lived for countless years saw them, they might associate them with the gods of their tribal myths. But in the demon lord's eyes, these two stone statues were some sort of taboo, brimming with loathing and wariness. In truth, he was very familiar with these two stone statues. When he was very young, he had seen them in the Stone of the Gods in the deepest part of the demon palace. He did not find it strange that these two stone statues had suddenly come from Shualao City's demon palace to White Emperor City. This was because on that night, during the sacrifice to the starry sky, he had personally seen those two pillars of light break through the wall and pour into these two stone statues. As he thought of something, the demon lord's face paled. After a while, he returned to normal. He was still very wary and doubtful of the sacrifice to the starry sky, but the circumstances had forced him to accept Black Robe's proposal. But now that he saw with his own eyes these two lifeless stone statues, he once more began to doubt his choice. "Father, your view might be correct. The starry sky can help us kill, and can also kill us." The demon lord gazed at the two stone statues, his hands behind his back slowly caressing an object made of stone. He slowly said, "But father, be at ease. I will not treat them as members of the same race. I will only use them as hunting dogs. If there comes a day when they understand, I will destroy this object." If Chun Changsheng were present, he would probably recognize what the object in his hands was. On that night in the snowy mountains, it was precisely this object made of stone that had pierced the old demon lord's abdomen, drawing out that destructive pillar of light from that side of the starry sky. Lulua's palace was at the highest point of White Emperor City, even higher than the White Emperor couple's palace. This was because she liked to climb high and see far. Of course, this also showed how much the White Emperor and his wife doted on her. But today, the fog over White Emperor City was even thicker than usual. Standing by the window, it was very difficult to see too far. The light was rather gloomy, and all one could see was the familiar red river and the green mountains on the opposite shore, the damp forest that seemed to smell, and the massive trees that loomed as high as the sky in the distance. These were the scenery she had seen for many years and was already used to, but for some reason, she felt a little unfamiliar today. Following that, she heard the noise coming from outside the palace. She heard the sound of war drums and sensed the aura of the wildfire stirred up by the beast dance. Was the ceremony really about to begin? She already knew what happened last night. On the surface, the Xiong clan leader and the other powerful figures appeared to be extremely domineering, but she understood that this was all a facade. In yesterday's battle between the divine domains, it was clear that his mother had obtained victory. Her prestige and momentum were at their strongest. Whether it was the chief elder or the other powerful figures of the demi-human race, other than clenching their axes and saying rebellion, there was nothing they could do to make his mother yield. What made her feel even sadder was that great elder clearly sensed her father's will. This meant that her father also knew of this matter. Last night, before leaving the imperial palace, the chief elder had come to see her. He had sworn a blood oath to ensure her safety, but he had said nothing about today's events. The heavenly selection ceremony would proceed as usual. Just like the raindrops falling from the sky, she was about to be married, and this could not be changed. Just who did her mother want her to marry? Why was she so confident that the person she chose would definitely be chosen by the ancestral spirit and endure the baptism of the heavenly flame in the heart of the tree? Luo gazed out the window at the extremely vigilant Red River Beast Guard as she pondered these questions. Last night, because she had been thinking about many things and arranging her future plans, she had not slept well, so her complexion was rather poor. Guardianly looked at her face and believed that she was suffering from insomnia because of her grief. She could not suppress her pity, and her eyes became moist. Through the tunnel, Guardianly brought a cup of acorn tea to Luoluo and whispered, "I've already obtained the key." Luoluo lightly shook her head. Those sky silkworms underground are not easy to deal with. Guardianly paled at the mention of the sky silkworms. She gave up on this plan and began to think of other ways to escape. Luoluo had not spoken the truth. The sky silkworms were the guardians of the abyss beneath White Emperor City. They possessed terrifying killing power and could freely travel through the abyss and mud. From a certain perspective, they could perfectly prevent any enemy from infiltrating through the ground. But she had already tried 3 years ago, and the sky silkworms had been unable to stop her. She rubbed the small stone tied to her neck. When she thought of how the sky silkworms had fled in fear, she happily laughed. Guardianly had no idea that this small stone was the legendary Heavenly Tome monolith. Seeing her laugh, she believed that she was too frightened and panicked, not knowing what to do. Only after Luoluo said a few comforting words did Guardianly calm down. Yes, even if she was heavily guarded by those valiant Red River Beast Guard, even if White Emperor City was secretly protected by seals, it would not be very difficult for her to escape. In the eyes of Madame Mu, in the eyes of the Xiong clan leader and the other elders, in the eyes of those demi-human generals and ministers, Princess Luo Hong had not diligently cultivated the imperial clan's techniques in the last few years. Her strength had advanced at an extremely slow pace, and she was still as delicate as she had been before she went to the capital. No one knew that she had always been very diligent in cultivation. Just like her teacher, she would wake up at 5 o'clock every day, close her eyes to meditate for 5 seconds, and then get up to wash her face and eat. After that, she would begin to meditate until late at night and fall asleep. Yes, her cultivation speed in the Imperial clan's techniques was very ordinary, even somewhat slow, but this was not because she lacked comprehension or because the problem with her meridians had not been resolved. It was because she spent the vast majority of her time completing the assignments her teacher had given her. To put another way, she spent the vast majority of her time studying the path of the sword. Besides the Heavenly Tome monoliths and her increasingly powerful cultivation in the path of the sword, she also had many powerful magical artifacts left behind by her father. It was not difficult at all for her to scare away those heaven silkworms underground. Her sorrow came more from the fact that in a few more days, she might not be able to see the scenery outside the stone window again. Yes, if nothing else happened, if her teacher could not make it to White Emperor City in time, then she could only leave by herself. Suddenly, an extremely sharp, even somewhat grating sound came from outside the stone window. It was the sound of the air being torn into shreds, the sound of a seal being forcefully broken by a high-speed object. Then, tinsome grunts came from outside the hall. The dust on the ground stirred up, the cool breeze suddenly vanished, and a figure appeared. The edges of this person's fluttering clothes carried the afterimages of the air vibrating at high speeds. From this, one could imagine just how fast this person had come. This person wore a rather old gown, the pattern of copper coins concealed within it. His face had a very indifferent expression, just like that of an ordinary wealthy man. If one noticed the yellow dirt on his boots, one might even mistake him for a landlord from the countryside who liked to personally farm.